In 2019, a family of 4 moved into a new house in a quiet suburb in Hawaii. They loved it until they discovered the dark secret their house held. This story is easily one of the spookiest true stories I have ever come across. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload once a week. So, if that's of interest to you, when the like button calls your restaurant to place a very long and complicated order for delivery, let them finish in their entirety before telling them they are outside of your delivery range. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly headed off to the very famous Little Vegas Chapel, which is located just off the Las Vegas, Nevada Strip, and they got married by a man dressed up as Elvis Presley while the couple stood in front of a pink Cadillac. While their wedding was certainly not traditional by Western standards, it somehow seemed fitting for the newlyweds. After all, they were not a traditional couple. Brittany, who was 36 years old, was extremely energetic and outgoing and bubbly, and she even referred to herself as being a little crazy. As for James, who was 35 years old, he was reserved and quiet and kind of analytical and would rarely act on impulse. And on top of these two just being complete and total polar opposites, they had actually dated previously back in high school, and it had not worked out. They had broken up and gone their separate ways, not expecting to see each other again. But nearly 2 decades later, they randomly reconnected, and this time they had something major in common. James was a single father of 2 young boys, and he was desperately looking for a partner to not only share his life with, but someone who would come in and help him raise his kids. As for Brittany, she too was single, and she really wanted to be a mother. And so the timing of their reunion was perfect. A year after the wedding, James, who was serving in the US Navy, was given orders to spend a couple of years working out of a naval base in Hawaii. So the family of 4, along with their little cat named Mr. Franklin, packed up all of their things and left the mainland of the United States, and they landed in Honolulu, which is the capital of Hawaii. The family would move into a modest 2-story home located just a couple of minutes drive away from the airport. The house was located at the end of a cul-de-sac in this very quiet and safe neighborhood that really didn't look like the type of neighborhood you would expect to see on a beautiful Hawaiian island. It really just kind of looked like typical American suburbs with all these cookie-cutter 2-story houses right up next to each other on either sides of the road, and out front everyone's got a white picket fence. But for the Campbells, who had never lived in Hawaii before and were used to living on mainland America, it was actually kind of nice to move into this neighborhood and have it look kind of familiar. And so before long, the Campbell family loved their new Hawaii house. That is, until they learned their house had a dark secret. It all started in June of 2019, so not long after the Campbells had moved to Hawaii. Brittany, she had to go into the garage to get something. Now, their garage was attached on the left side of their house if you were looking at their house from the street, and there was a door on the first floor of the house that led into the garage. And so Brittany, she walked across the first floor, she opened that door in the house, she went into the garage, she flipped on the light switch, and what she saw all over the garage made no sense to her. They still had a bunch of moving boxes that they had not unpacked since they'd only been in Hawaii for a matter of weeks. And so all these unopened boxes, they had just kind of stacked up inside of the garage. But when Brittany had turned the lights on and looked into the garage, she saw nearly all of those boxes had been toppled over, and lots of the contents inside of these boxes had spilled out onto the ground. But even more bizarrely, it looked like it wasn't totally haphazard. It looked like someone had intentionally kind of sifted through the boxes and taken out random objects and put them into strange piles that didn't make any sense. The objects were not alike. Or they had taken the objects and kind of stood them up in these strange arrangements, almost like they were being laid out for a garage sale. And so Brittany immediately just turns around and she leaves the garage, she goes to the other side of the house, and and she gets her husband. She brings James back and he looks inside. He's just as shocked as she is. And the two of them immediately just go into the garage and begin looking through all of the stuff to see if anything is missing. Now, it was pretty difficult to tell if something had been stolen, but they did have some valuable stuff that was in those boxes that had been pulled out and was lying on the ground, and that wasn't missing. And so that was a pretty good indication to James and Brittany that this wasn't a robbery. And so the only other thing they could think of would be that their two young sons must have come in here and been goofing around and pulled the boxes over, and so this is their doing. But when the parents confronted the two young sons, they said they didn't do it. Brittany believed them, but James didn't necessarily. He thought they could be lying about it, and if they were telling the truth, then, maybe one of their pets had gotten into the garage and caused all this chaos. They had purchased a dog when they got to Hawaii, so they had a cat and a dog. And so James was just being very dismissive of this whole garage incident and not taking seriously the fact that Brittany was really spooked by this. But regardless of how the family members felt about the garage incident, they all just kind of moved on because there really wasn't anything to do except pick the garage up and continue on. About a week after the garage incident, Brittany was home alone one morning getting ready. She was sitting in the master bedroom in front of her mirror and she was applying eyeliner and she had a YouTube video playing some makeup tutorials. And as she's applying the makeup, she suddenly hears the front door downstairs slam shut. She almost pokes her eye out with her eyeliner. She's so startled by the sound of it. And she immediately pauses her YouTube video and she calls out for James and her sons, believing they must be home and somebody slammed the door. But when she calls out, she gets no response. Now, immediately, Brittany is going through all of these different rationalizations like, okay, maybe James and the boys opened the door, they got something or put something in the house, they slammed it and they left. And so that's why they didn't hear me call their name. But she couldn't help but feel like something was wrong. She's also thinking about the garage incident, which really never left her. She pretended like she had moved on, but really she hadn't. And so she stands up and she begins walking towards the open door that led out into the hallway. And then from the master bedroom, if you were looking out into the second floor hallway, it basically went straight across to another door. That was her son's bedroom. And in between these two doors, basically halfway down the second floor hallway, to the left was a flight of stairs that went straight down to the first floor. And when you reached the bottom of those steps, right in front of you would be the front door, the door that had slammed. And so Brittany reaches the threshold of the master bedroom. She's looking out into the second floor hallway. She doesn't see anyone. And so she yells out again for James and for her sons, but again, there's silence. And so she takes a deep breath and she begins walking down the second floor hallway, and she makes it halfway. She turns left and she gets onto the stairs. And as she's walking down these steps, the house is eerily quiet and she's got this growing sense of dread inside of her, and she's kind of quietly calling out for James and her sons, but it's totally quiet. And she gets to the foot of the stairs. She kind of scans around her. She doesn't see anyone. And then she walks to the front door. She flings it open, expecting, hoping to see James's car in the driveway or just see some indication that her husband or her sons had been there or were there. But when she opened that door, James's car was not there. There was no sign of anybody in the area. It was just her. And so with her heart racing, she shut the door, she locked it, and then she walked all around the first floor, checking every window, checking every door, making sure everything was locked. She went upstairs, she did the same thing, checking every room, every closet. There was no one in the house with her. She was sure of it. And so she went back to her room thinking to herself, what do I make of that? How do I reconcile the fact that I clearly heard the front door slam, but no one's here? And so Brittany would eventually leave the house and go about her day. And then that evening, she would come back home and her husband and her sons would be there. And at some point, she would bring up the slamming door to her husband to get a sense of, could that have been him? And he would tell her that no, he had not come by the house that day, so that could not have been him. But he assured his wife, don't worry, you probably just unlocked the door and a draft came through and slammed the door. You got nothing to worry about. But Brittany would tell her husband that that was just not possible, that she always shut the door. She always shut and locked the door. So the idea that she had forgotten to lock it and had left it partially ajar enough to the point that a draft could slam it the way it did, it just didn't make any sense. But just like the garage incident, James was very dismissive and just told his wife, you're being super paranoid. You have nothing to worry about. It's just a door. Don't worry about it. But this really upset Brittany and she got mad at James. And before long, the two were just totally fighting about it. And by the time they actually laid their heads down on their pillows that night, They weren't even speaking. And so the couple that night, they fall asleep angrily, and then in the middle of the night, Brittany wakes up suddenly. She doesn't know why she's woken up, but she's kind of looking around the room. It's totally silent, and she's trying to get her bearings. And as she's sitting there, she hears downstairs, not a slamming door, but the sound of a door opening and then shutting. Immediately, she is on heightened alert. And instead of doing anything, she just kind of leans forward and listens really intently to make sure she really heard what she thought she just heard. And as she's sitting there listening, she can hear again another door downstairs, a different door, opening and then shutting. And at this point, she begins to panic. She reaches over, she shakes James awake, and she tells him, I can hear someone opening and shutting doors downstairs. Now, James was not remotely thrilled to be having this conversation. He was still mad at his wife for being so paranoid about the door earlier, and so to be woken up in the middle of the night to his wife freaking out about more doors being open and shut, he was just really upset. And so he sits up, he's totally annoyed, and he's not ready to really take seriously anything Brittany is saying, and Brittany's picking up on this. And so finally, she just says, James, did you lock the front door before you went to bed? And so James is like, yes, I locked the front door. I'm telling you, you're hearing things. There's nothing going on in this house. But Brittany was not convinced. And she says, you know what? You can think nothing's going on, but I'm going downstairs to make sure no one is in this house. And so Brittany would get out of her bed. She'd walk over to the open door that led into the second floor hallway. And as soon as she looked out, she didn't see anything. She didn't hear anything. And so very slowly, she began walking down the second floor hallway until she reached the top of the stairs. And at that point, she turned and looked downstairs into the pitch black first floor. She was terrified, but she knew she had to go down there to make sure her family was safe. And so down the stairs she went, and when she got to the bottom of the stairs, she saw right away the front door was unlocked. Brittany's thinking, why would my husband tell me he locked the door if it's not locked? And so then Brittany's thinking, okay, my sons must have gotten out of bed and they must have unlocked the door. That's what I'm hearing. I'm hearing these doors opening and shutting because my sons are down here somewhere and they're the ones causing all this noise. And so Brittany kind of felt relieved for a second because this seemed like what must be going on. But after locking the front door and then searching the whole first floor, she didn't find her sons. And then when she went upstairs again and went into her boys' room, she found both of them were fast asleep in their beds. And when she shook them awake, they showed no sign of having been awake recently. They were totally groggy and could not have been running around the house just minutes earlier. And so now Brittany is terrified. She tucks her boys back in and she tells them, everything's fine. But then she hustles back over to the master bedroom with her husband and she tells James, the front door was unlocked and our sons were fast asleep. It couldn't have been them. But James continues to be very dismissive, telling his wife, you are totally overreacting, you're being paranoid, you're just hearing the sound of those doors because you're scared. There isn't any doors slamming in the house. And as he's saying this, their back sliding door downstairs that led to their backyard suddenly slammed open and then slammed shut. And as soon as this happened, James, who had been so dismissive and totally skeptical, he instantly changed. And he looked at his wife and he said, you stay right here. And he jumped out of his bed and he ran out of the bedroom. A few minutes later, he would come back into the master bedroom and he would tell his wife that, the back door, it was unlocked, but it was shut. I'm sure you just forgot to lock it. And the same draft that is opening and shutting doors, probably opened and shut the back door too. So we got nothing to worry about. The house is locked right now. Let's just get in bed and go to sleep. And at this, Brittany is incredulous. And she says to her husband, you gotta be kidding me. There is something weird happening in our house. Doors are opening and shutting. We had that thing with the garage. You can't act like nothing is happening. And this, in turn, turned into a big fight. And so before long, the parents weren't even talking about who opened and shut the doors downstairs. They were just fighting with each other. And then eventually, they were just so tired that they gave up and they both went to sleep. For the next few weeks, nothing happened inside of the house. Brittany, though, continued to obsess over who or what had been causing those doors to open and shut, and then also, what happened in the garage, what caused all that stuff to fall out and wind up in these strange arrangements. Meanwhile, James continued to be unbelievably dismissive and did not want to talk about the potential for something strange happening in their house. But something strange would happen to just James without Brittany around, and that would be the first time that he would get really spooked. Today's video is sponsored by NordVPN. Now, I know what you're thinking. This is probably just another ad for cheap cigarettes for my pet dolphin. But no, It's not, don't worry. This ad is for all my good, honest, hardworking people that just want to kick back and relax and purchase a high-quality rabid turtle to send to the like button without being interrupted by disgusting pesky pop-up ads. If you're living this pop-up nightmare right now, then today is your lucky day because NordVPN exists. A VPN, or virtual private network, is a service that keeps you safe when you browse the internet, and NordVPN is the brand name in the VPN space. Not only will NordVPN ensure that all your data remains behind their wall of next-generation encryption, but also, most importantly, through their latest feature, Threat Protection, they will automatically block all those disgusting pop-up ads that have been destroying your opportunity to buy a quality rab turret. NordVPN's Threat Protection will also protect you from malicious sites, trackers, and downloads. So, you can either go waste your money on any of the hundreds of so-called deals out there for cheap dolphin cigarettes, as if that exists, or you can be a big dog, sign up for NordVPN, and buy an infinite number of quality rab turrets without interruption. Talk about a no-brainer. Currently, the best deal for NordVPN is through my YouTube offer. Right now, NordVPN is offering viewers an exclusive 2-year plan at a huge discount, plus an additional month free when you go to nordvpn.com/MrBallen. And it's risk-free with Nord's 30-day money-back guarantee. Again, that's nordvpn.com/MrBallen, or click the link in the description below. Okay, back to the story. It was a couple of weeks after the nighttime door slamming incident, and James, he was alone at his house. It's the middle of the day, and he decided he would just play the piano. And so he moved to his piano in the living room, which is on the first floor. He sat down and he began playing. And then after a little while, he started to feel like he was being watched. And it got to the point where it was so uncomfortable, he had to stop playing and actually look around and make sure he really was alone. And when he did that, he noticed out the window to his right, which led into the side yard, that there was clearly a figure standing in the window outside looking in with its arms down. But there was a curtain over the window, and so all he could see was this shadow figure standing at the window. And so James is immediately startled, and as soon as he reacted to this figure, the figure suddenly starts moving towards the back of the house. And so James, he gets up and he rushes over to another window that looked into the backyard, and he looks outside, and there's no one there. And then he goes back to the window he originally saw the figure in, he opens it up, there's no one there. And so James would ultimately tell himself that, okay, that must have just been some nosy neighbor that heard the music, they came over, and they noticed that maybe I saw them, and they ran off before I could see them. And so that's what it was. But deep down, what he saw in the window really shook him up. However, it would be the blanket incident that would finally push James to go from being dismissive and skeptical to admitting to his wife, we got a problem. It was not long after James spotted that dark figure outside of the window when he and his wife and his 2 kids decided they would head out to a movie theater to catch a movie. And so as they're getting ready to go, Brittany would say that she wanted to bring along a particular blanket that the whole family loved to use when they were sitting on the couch. She was going to bring that blanket with her to the movie theater to kind of cuddle up under for the movie. And so she would make her way into the living room and she would see the blanket was missing. It was not on the couch where it normally was. And so she would ask her husband and her sons if they had any idea where it was, and they would say, no, we haven't touched it. She would look all over the place, under the couch, in the living room. She went upstairs. She couldn't find it. And so finally, they just left without the blanket. But when they came back that evening, there on the couch, folded up neatly, was this blanket. Everybody knew that blanket had not been there when they left. So how did it get there? For the next few weeks, the parents did their best to put on a brave face and tell their kids that everything was okay, but the parents and the kids were all terrified to be in that house. And that's because, at night, the doors continued to open and shut. Their dog periodically would just start barking in the middle of the night for no apparent reason, and they would all get this awful sense that they were being watched all the time in their house. And so finally, by September of that year, the parents decided, we just have to get out of this house. We cannot be here. We need to take a break. And so they packed up their stuff and they flew to mainland America, where they stayed with some family for a week. On September 20th, they hopped back on a plane and they flew back to Honolulu. And as they're driving from the airport to their house, Brittany and James were just kind of secretly hoping that, whatever weirdness was happening in their house would just magically stop once they returned. But as soon as James turned onto their street and they could see their house, they knew that was not going to be the case. Because as they began driving up their road, they could see James's very nice road bike was laying on their driveway. And so Brittany, she turned to her husband, and even though she knew the answer, she said, "James, were you riding your bike before we left?" And James, who doesn't even look at his wife, just shakes his head. No, he wasn't. And so James drives all the way down the road. He turns into their driveway, which is lined up right with the front of the garage door. And after James parks the car, he hits the garage door opener button. And so as James is sitting in the driver's seat, Brittany's right next to him, the kids are in back. They're watching as this door is raising right in front of them. And as soon as they can see into the garage, they see everything in their garage has just been completely trashed. Things are not just dumped out, but things have been ripped apart and shredded as if a wild animal had been let loose inside of the garage. James immediately said to his wife, "We've been robbed." And then he hopped out of the car and then turned and told his kids, "You stay in the car, do not get out." And James, he went over to the side of the house and got a sledgehammer for protection and made his way to the front door. Meanwhile, Brittany would be on the phone with 911 to report that someone had broken into their house. A few minutes later, James was inside of his house and he saw the entirety of his house was just like the garage. It had been completely ripped to shreds. But amidst the chaos were those kind of strange piles of random objects, much like they had seen in that first garage incident where the things inside of the boxes had been stacked in kind of strange piles and arrangements. And so James is looking around his first floor and he's seeing stacks of coasters and books and electronics. But what really got James's attention was that on various surfaces, there were these medical vials of drugs or chemicals that were placed all over the place. And he knew that was not his family's. Someone had brought those vials into this house. James would make his way up the stairs to the second floor landing, and right away he could tell, the upstairs had all the hallmarks of being destroyed as much as the first floor. But when he went left and went into his boys' room, he saw that room was pristine. In fact, it had been cleaned. The boys' laundry was neatly folded on one side of the room, their beds were perfectly made with military precision, and all of their toys and different things that were normally all over the floor were neatly put away in the places they should go. And so James would turn around and leave his boys' room in absolute astonishment, and he would walk across the second floor hallway into the master bedroom. And what he would find in there would make an already terrible situation much, much worse. The master bedroom was destroyed like the majority of the house and garage, except the top of their bed was not covered in junk. Instead, on their bed was this towel that had been neatly laid out, almost like a tablecloth. And laying on this towel, neatly spaced apart, kind of perfectly arranged, were a bunch of knives. And then next to the knives, still on the towel, was a laptop that the Campbell family owned, but they didn't use it. It did work, but it just kind of sat in the master bedroom. And this laptop was sitting on this towel, and it was open, but the screen had turned off. And so by this point, Brittany had come upstairs. And so Brittany and James, they walk over in horror to this layout on their bed, and they click the keys on the keyboard of their laptop, and it illuminates the screen and shows whatever was being worked on last. And it's this long, long Word document that neither of them made. They scrolled to the top of this document, and the document was titled The Omnivore Trials, and then below that it said, A Rehabilitation for Rat-like People. And then below that, the entire document was kind of like a diary. It was a whole bunch of observations about so-called specimens, and these specimens were very clearly the Campbell family. And these observations made about the Campbell family were very intimate. In fact, the only way to garner these observations were if you were watching the Campbell family right up close, almost on an hourly basis for days, weeks, months at a time. These observations ranged from what time the Campbell family liked to watch TV to what James and Brittany talked about behind closed doors in their bedroom, including their struggle to have a child, something they were not not talking about to their family. But in this document, the author of the Omnivore Trials would talk about how the creature, which was referencing Brittany, needed to stop trying to have another baby and instead focus on the children she already had. Toward the end of this really lengthy document, the author of the Omnivore Trials came to a shocking conclusion that in order to rehabilitate these rat-like people, the Campbells, the author would have to perform several surgeries on the specimens. These surgeries were hand amputations and gender reassignment surgeries. And then after this conclusion, there was another note that detailed all the different surgeon tools the author would need to perform these surgeries, as well as a list of drugs and chemicals they would need in order to sedate these specimens before they performed these surgeries. And so after James and Brittany see this, they realize that those knives laying out on the towel were for them. Those were the knives that were going to be used for the surgeries. And all those weird vials, those medical vials they saw all downstairs, those were likely the drugs that would be used to sedate them so they could go under the knife. 15 minutes before James and Brittany went into their house and discovered the knives, the medical vials, and the laptop, James grabbed that sledgehammer and walked to the front door while his wife called 911. And so James, he gets to the front door, he puts his key into the lock, he unlocks it, and with the sledgehammer in one hand, he attempts to push the door open. But despite the door being unlocked, he can't open it. There's resistance behind the door. And so James kind of gets down and he presses as hard as he can into the door with his shoulder until finally it opens up just a crack and James can see into the house. And so James, as he's pressing the door barely open, he's staring into this crack, trying to make out what's going on inside of his house. And then suddenly a set of eyes meet his from behind the door. And before James can do anything, this man that is standing inside of his house says to James,
"This is not your house,"
and then proceeds to push the door shut on James. James, in an adrenaline-fueled fury, smashed the door open, grabbed this guy, and yanked him out of the house and threw him onto the front yard. And then James, with his sledgehammer, would stand in front of this guy between him and his kids and his wife, and he would say, "If you go anywhere, I'm going to have to attack you with this." But the intruder, this guy, whose name was Ezekiel Zayas, he was a 23-year-old young man, he would just stand on the Campbell's property, staring directly at James, unblinking. And then, a couple of minutes later, the police would show up, and Ezekiel would not put up any fight. He would be arrested, and he would be taken away. It was after he was gone that James and his wife would actually go into their house, and they would see the state it was in, and they would go upstairs, and they would discover the knives and the laptop. It would turn out, months earlier, Ezekiel had apparently found a way to sneak in and out of the Campbell's property. And so around the time they had moved in, Ezekiel was living there as well. He was mostly living in the crawl space above the second floor bathroom. And then whenever he was able to, Ezekiel would climb down out of this crawl space and he would go and observe the Campbells. And this was not just at night. Based on some of the observations inside of Ezekiel's Omnivore Trials document, clearly he was watching the family in the middle of the day too. Also, based on these observations in this document, it was pretty clear that Ezekiel was getting ready to actually carry out these surgeries on the Campbell family, meaning the Campbells' decision to go on vacation when they did could very well have saved their lives. And if there was any question as to whether Ezekiel could have actually carried out that level of physical harm on another human being by carrying out those surgeries, well, after he was arrested for what he did to the Campbells, while he was in jail, he beat his cellmate to death. Allegedly, although a guard literally walked in and saw Ezekiel punching and kicking and beating this guy, and then he died. But technically the trial is not over, so it's allegedly. Ezekiel is currently in a state hospital, and they are trying to determine if he is fit to stand trial for what he did to the Campbells and for what he did to his cellmate. Even though it might be self-explanatory at this point in the video, it's worth pointing out that we have no idea what Ezekiel's motives were for why he did the things he did to the Campbell family or what he was looking to achieve with the so-called Omnivore Trials. We also don't know why he allegedly killed his cellmate. As for the Campbells, this whole experience was so traumatic that they did not stay at their Hawaii house. They moved, and as of today, their whereabouts are unknown. So that's going to do it. If you got something out of today's episode and you haven't done this already, when the like button calls your restaurant to place a long, complicated order for delivery, wait until they're completely done to tell them they are out of your delivery range. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. We now have a podcast called the MrBallen Podcast, and we upload brand new stories on Monday mornings. On Thursday mornings, we upload remastered my wife, my family, my team, in supporting those who have been most affected by violent and heinous crime. Monthly donors to the MrBallen Foundation Honor Them Society will receive free gifts and exclusive invites to special live events. Go to MrBallen.Foundation and click on Get Involved to join the Honor Them Society today. We also have 2 additional YouTube channels. One is called MrBallen Shorts. The other is called MrBallen en Espanol. We also post near daily content on Facebook and Snapchat. Those pages are just called MrBallen. If you want to get in touch with me, please follow me on any major social media platform and then send me a direct message. My username is just @MrBallen, and I really do read the majority of my DMs. We have some really cool merchandise, so head on over to shopmrballen.com to have a look. So, whether I see you on Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, Reddit, YouTube, Facebook, other YouTube channels, the podcast, wherever, just know that I really appreciate your support, and until next time, that's going to do it. See ya. Today, I'm going to tell you about a mystery that is both incredibly haunting and incredibly weird. There are so many clues and pieces of evidence in this mystery, but they all basically point in different directions, or in some cases, literally defy the laws of physics. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload 2, 3, even 4 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, please offer to make the like button a nice, tasty dessert, a mud pie. But don't tell them you're using real mud. Also, please subscribe to our channel. Around 1 a.m. on May 16, 2006, a 35-year-old woman named Allison Rivera bolted upright suddenly in her bed in her home in Baltimore, Maryland. Her home security alarm was blaring. But even though that was obviously pretty surprising, it didn't really surprise her, because the alarm had gone off at almost the exact same time the night before. And so now, in the dark, Allison could see the shape of her husband, Ray, as he grabbed a baseball bat, and then Ray rushed out of the room and down the stairs he went, and Allison quickly trailed right behind him. And when the two of them got downstairs, the alarm's still going off, they flipped on the lights and they looked around, but Allison didn't see anybody inside of their house, and all the doors were shut. But when she looked at one specific window, she saw it was just slightly open. And again, this didn't totally surprise her, because the previous night when their alarm had gone off, they had gotten in touch with the police, and the police had looked around, and even though they didn't find anybody, they discovered that that particular window that was currently open slightly had been tampered with the night before, which set off the alarm, and it apparently had happened again tonight. But the police didn't think this was an attempted break-in. They said the alarm had probably been set off by a squirrel. Now, at the time, Allison and Ray had, thought that was pretty crazy that a squirrel had set off the alarm here, but it seemed plausible, and the police seemed pretty certain of it, and so they had accepted it and just gone back to bed after, turning off the alarm and shutting the window again. But now, 24 hours later, to be standing in their house, the alarm's going off, and clearly this window has been lifted up again, it just seemed weird that a squirrel's doing this? That just seems far-fetched. Something's off here. And so Allison and Ray, they couldn't help but feel like maybe the police were wrong. Maybe this is an attempted break-in by a person, not a squirrel. In fact, Allison had this nagging fear about what was maybe going on here that she couldn't shake. She wondered if someone might be out to get her husband, Ray. Ray and Allison had recently moved to Baltimore because Ray had gotten a job at this financial investment firm called Stansberry and Associates that was in the city. Ray's actual job was to write the firm's email newsletter, which gave advice to subscribers about buying and selling stocks. But Ray didn't actually know anything about investing. His background was in screenwriting and freelance videography, not finance. And the only reason he'd gotten the job was because one of his friends owned the company and had basically hired him as a favor. So even though Ray was sort of trying his best here, some of the advice that he was pumping out in this newsletter was terrible, and people had very likely lost money because of it. So it felt possible that maybe one of these disgruntled subscribers could have found Allison and Ray's address and was now trying to get even with Ray. But even though this seemed plausible, that theory was kind of wild and conspiratorial, and so on this night, Allison didn't say anything about these fears to Ray. Instead, she just went over and turned off the alarm while Ray did a sweep of the house and then also made sure this window was firmly shut. And then afterward, Allison asked Ray if maybe they should call the police again. But, Ray just said no. He said, very likely it was just a squirrel like the police said, and so the house is safe, we're okay, let's just go to bed. And so even though Allison felt pretty uneasy here, she said okay, and the two of them went back to bed. Early the next morning, Allison sat at the dining room table and quickly ate the breakfast that Ray had made for her. She was leaving that morning for a business trip 3 hours away in Virginia, and she needed to get on the road. So after finishing her food, she put her plate in the sink, and then Ray carried her suitcase out to her car for her, and then she and Ray exchanged I love yous, and then Allison got into the car and drove off, waving at Ray as she left. 3 hours later, Allison made it to Virginia. She would spend the entire day working, and then finally, at about 6:30 p.m., she checked into the hotel where she was staying. By this point, Allison was so exhausted that she practically collapsed onto the hotel bed. All she wanted to do was just check in with Ray, watch a little TV, and go to sleep. So she took out her phone and she called him. It rang a few times, but just went to voicemail. So Allison waited and then tried again. But the same thing happened, which was odd. Allison wondered if Ray wasn't picking up because something had come up with work or maybe family. Normally he would answer, and certainly he'd be expecting a call from her around this time. But fortunately, one of Allison's colleagues, whose name was Claudia, was actually staying with them in Baltimore. She was traveling through the area, and so that night, she was going to be there with Ray. So Allison called Claudia, who did pick up, and she asked Claudia if Ray was around. And what Claudia said was pretty surprising. She said a couple hours earlier, so between 5 and 6 o'clock, Ray had been at the house. He'd been doing something on his computer down the hall from the guest room where Claudia was staying. And from the guest room, Claudia said she heard Ray's cell phone ring. He picked up the call, and a few seconds later, he said, quote, "Oh shit." Then Ray, literally, according to Claudia, sprinted out of the house. Claudia heard him climb into his car, and he peeled out of the neighborhood. Claudia said she had no idea where he'd gone, and he still was not back. Now, obviously, Allison was confused when she heard this, but she did not immediately panic. She figured that whatever had sent Ray running out of the house was probably just an emergency with work or friends or family, which, could be bad, but she assumed Ray would call her back and explain everything as soon as he got a chance. And so Allison thanked Claudia, doing her best not to give off any vibes that she was worried, and then she hung up and began getting ready for bed. And the whole time, Allison is watching her phone, waiting for what she is sure will be a call from Ray. The next morning at 5:30 a.m., Allison woke up to the sound of her phone finally ringing. She felt this immediate jolt of hope that it was Ray calling to explain what was going on, but when she looked at the face of her phone, she saw it was actually Claudia calling. But she figured, okay, maybe Claudia is with Ray and she has an update that everything's fine and that this is all going to be explained. And so Allison picked up and she goes, "Hey, Claudia, is my husband back? Is everything okay?" And Claudia said, "Your husband has not come home yet. I have no idea what's going on with him, but I have to leave. I have to go to the airport." At this point, Allison couldn't even hide her worry in her voice. She basically was completely panic-stricken. What was going on with Ray? It was completely unlike him to stay out all night, miss her calls, and still not be home. She had no idea what was going on here. So she told Claudia, who at this point is basically saying, "Do you want me to stay and wait for your husband?" She was sort of insinuating this. Allison told Claudia, "Go ahead, go to the airport, do your thing. I'm going to cancel my work trip. I'm coming home. I got to figure out what's going on with Ray." As soon as Allison was off the phone, she packed up her stuff, she checked out of the hotel, and began the 3-hour drive back to Baltimore. As she drove, she did her best to stay calm, but, she's calling Ray's cell phone basically the whole time, over and over and over again, and he wasn't answering. And then eventually, when she would call, it wouldn't even ring. It would just go straight to voicemail, suggesting that his phone was turned off or maybe, had died. And at that point, Allison really couldn't control her panic. I mean, she knew something's wrong here. She had this theory that had something to do with her husband. She couldn't prove it. She had no evidence. It just felt like something bad has happened here, and she had no idea what it was. And so Allison spent the rest of the drive frantically calling Ray's workplace, his friends, his family, asking everybody if they had heard from him or if they had called him and said something that freaked him out the previous evening, anything. But everyone she spoke to said they had not seen or heard from Ray. When Allison finally pulled onto her street, she had this hope, this small hope that she would get home and Ray's car would be there and Ray would be inside and he'd have a story that would explain this whole crazy thing. But no, she got there, his car was gone, the house is empty, and she just knew something is definitely wrong. And so she turned right around and drove to the police station. However, when Allison reported her husband was missing to the police, it was immediately clear to her that the police were not really that concerned. Ray was an adult who had apparently left the house of his own volition. He also hadn't even been gone for a full 24 hours yet. So the police took down Allison's report and they did tell her they would look for him. But she just felt like they were not nearly as concerned as she was. But Allison and Ray's friends and family were definitely concerned. And over the next few days, they flocked to Baltimore to support Allison and also to help look for Ray. They drove all around the city, literally looking for Ray, but they didn't see any sign of him anywhere. They called local hospitals and asked about any John Does who maybe had come in, but none of them matched Ray's description. They also checked Ray's bank records, but he hadn't used any of his cards since he had disappeared. And as days passed with no new information and no new updates from police, Allison only got more and more desperate. And so finally, one afternoon, a couple of days after Ray first went missing, she just started looking through her own house, looking for any clues about where Ray had gone. And eventually, when she was in that room where Ray had been at his computer, when Claudia had heard him, swear into the phone and bolt out of the house, in that room at Ray's desk, she did find something strange. It was this piece of paper that was folded up really small, and it was wrapped in plastic, and it was taped to the back of his computer monitor. And so Allison peeled off the tape, she opened up the bag, and she unwrapped the paper. And what she found is it was a typed letter addressed to, quote, brothers and sisters. And then the actual contents of this letter made absolutely no sense. It referenced some kind of secret society called the Council. It talked about secrets and some kind of game, and it also contained 3 lists. One with technologies like Wi-Fi and Bluetooth. There was one with a bunch of movie titles that seemed to be completely random. And also there was one with names of real people, but they included celebrities and also some of Ray's family members. Now, to any random person, this note would have probably looked pretty unhinged, maybe even like a possible manifestation of serious mental illness. But to Allison, it actually didn't read that way. She knew Ray was very interested in conspiracies and secret societies from a creative standpoint. And so after a brief moment of confusion when she first read this thing, she decided, maybe this document was him collecting ideas for a new screenplay. It wouldn't have surprised her at all if he was trying to write a script about the Council, whatever that was. But what did surprise Allison was the way this letter was printed, folded up, and then taped to the computer. It just seemed so weird. So Allison actually took the note to the police station and handed it over to the officer in charge of Ray's case. The officer took it as evidence and said they'd be in touch with her about it. But they weren't in touch, and more days went by and Ray didn't show up and there were no updates from police, and so Allison really didn't know what to do. But then on May 22nd, so 6 days after Ray disappeared, Allison was at home when she got her call from her parents. They said they'd been driving around the city looking for Ray, and they had found something. BetterHelp is the paid partner of today's video. Heaviness in your life doesn't usually announce itself. Typically, it just sort of hits you.
For example, when I left the military and had to reintegrate back into civilian life, that meant I was leaving behind a clear mission, I was leaving behind tight-knit bonds, and an identity that was built on service and purpose, while I was also trying to find my place in a world that felt very unfamiliar. And so this made me carry this really deep emotional weight that I was not expecting. Now, at the time, I kind of told myself that feeling, that heaviness inside of me, that it would just sort of pass with time. Once I get situated as a civilian, it'll just go away. But it didn't. And eventually, I began to wonder, why am I still struggling with this? Why do I still feel this really intense weight on me? Well, the reason for that is emotional weight does not just disappear because your life moves on. It stays with you unless you deal with it. That heaviness, it's not like a symbol of a failure in your life. In reality, it's just your brain holding on to what at one point was keeping you safe. Now, if you're feeling this way, having some awareness around this definitely helps. But untangling it, getting this weight sort of off your shoulders, often requires someone trained to help you let it go. The new year is not about pretending the past didn't happen. It's about finding support that helps you feel lighter moving forward. A great starting point for anybody who thinks they could use this type of service is BetterHelp. With over 30,000 licensed therapists, you'll have access to a diverse community of professionals across different specialties, backgrounds, and locations. Click the link in the description or go to betterhelp.com/MrBallen for 10% off your first month and take a step toward feeling lighter in 2026. A few minutes later, Allison skidded into a parking lot in downtown Baltimore and parked her car right next to her parents' car. The area was swarming with police officers and news vans, and through this chaotic crowd, Allison could see what they were all looking at. It was Ray's car. And so Allison jumped out of her vehicle and she ran to the nearest police officer and she asked them what was going on. And they told her, after Allison's parents had called her about Ray's car, that was the thing they had found, they'd called the police and officers had come to investigate. And they discovered that Ray's car had a parking ticket on the windshield that showed it had been parked in this lot for 6 days. So since the evening of May 16th, which meant Ray's car had been right here since the night he'd gone missing, which was May 16th. The officer told her that none of Ray's belongings, like his phone or his money clip, were inside the vehicle, and there was no sign of a break-in, so they weren't stolen from the vehicle. So on the surface, it appeared that on the night Ray went missing, he'd driven here, parked in this lot, gotten out, but after that, nobody knows what happened. This discovery sent Allison's fear and panic to a whole new level. And it also seemed to make the police and the public take Ray's disappearance much more seriously. All of a sudden, people all over the city were looking for Ray. And 2 days later, on May 24th, so this is 8 days into Ray's disappearance, a volunteer search party decided to go onto the roof of a downtown parking garage to get a better view of the city to help with their search for Ray. And when they got up there, they saw something that, if it had to do with Ray, it was very dark. And so they called the police. Adjacent to this parking garage was a historic building called the Belvedere. It used to be a hotel, but now it was just a condo complex. The Belvedere, at its highest point, was 13 stories high. But it also had a smaller section that was still a part of the Belvedere that was just 2 stories high, and they kind of butted up against the 13-story section. From the top of the parking garage where the search party was, they could see the Belvedere, of course, but they could also look down and see the roof of the smaller section of the Belvedere. They could see the very top of that building. And on the roof, they saw 4 things: a pair of flip-flops, a pair of glasses, a cell phone, and a very obvious hole in the roof. Within the hour, a detective named Michael Bayer and a team of Baltimore PD officers followed a concierge down the hallway of the Belvedere Hotel building. When Detective Bayer and his team had arrived, they'd asked the building staff about a hole in the roof of that 2-story section of the Belvedere, but none of them knew what the police were talking about. The employees said that 2-story section of the hotel where the hole apparently was closed off and had been for a long time, so nobody, at least none of them, had gone over there, not anytime recently, and so they really legs had been broken so badly that the bones were sticking up at odd angles, and he was very badly decomposed, and so obviously was responsible for the smell. At first glance, Detective Bayer is looking at Ray's body, he's looking at the roof, and he's thinking, okay, clearly Ray, fell through the roof down here. That's how he's got here. He came through the roof. But when police examined the hole, and also those items that the search party had literally seen from their vantage point on the roof, the glasses, the flip-flops, and the cell phone, and then also when they did an autopsy on Ray's body, they realized that it actually was physically impossible for Ray to have come through the hole into this room. Because there were only 3 possible places that Ray could have fallen or jumped from to land on the Belvedere's roof where the hole was. And none of them made sense when compared to the evidence that police had. The first possibility was that Ray had fallen or jumped from the very top of the Belvedere, which is 13 stories tall. A fall from that height would definitely have killed him and caused the devastating injuries found in the autopsy, like broken legs, a broken skull, broken ribs. But the edge of the 13th story roof was 45 feet away horizontally from the hole in the 2nd story roof. And so from a physics perspective, it was basically impossible that Ray could have somehow gone fast enough and then leapt off the roof as fast and as far as he could, that he could have carried himself 45 feet forward before plummeting down and hitting the roof. That's just too far of a distance for a person to jump. The second possibility was that Ray maybe had gone off of a thin decorative ledge that wrapped around the outside of the Belvedere on the 11th floor. If Ray fell from there, he could have landed in the spot where the hole was. However, that ledge was impossible to access without first going through a privately owned condo or office. Ray would have had to be physically let in, but again, nobody in any part of the building had reported seeing or interacting with him. And the third possibility was that Ray had gone off the top of that same parking garage that the search party had been at. It was close enough horizontally that, Ray could have landed in the spot where the hole was. But the very top of that parking garage was only about 20 feet above the 2nd story roof of the Belvedere, which was obviously enough of a height to fall to have serious damage done to your body, but that's not enough of a fall to cause the extreme injuries that were found on Ray's body. It just wasn't enough. And then to make this whole situation even stranger, when police examined those items that were found on the roof, Ray's flip-flops, his glasses, and cell phone, they found that all the items were not, helter-skelter, sort of cast around as if he blasted through the roof and everything fell off of him. No, they were sort of organized, placed neatly on the roof like they had been staged on purpose. And also, Ray's glasses and phone were not damaged at all. So it just sort of begged the question, how could this have happened? How did he fall in the first place? How did he wind up in this room? But even if you identify where he fell from or how he fell, how did his belongings wind up placed so neatly on the roof like that without any damage? It just didn't add up. And so the police didn't know what to make of any of this. And so they turned their attention back to a totally different piece of evidence. That weird note that Allison had found taped to the back of Ray's computer in their home. And so they sent that note to the FBI for analysis, hoping it would tell them something. And it did. The FBI said that, based on the note, Ray was likely mentally ill and experiencing some kind of psychotic episode. This was not like a screenplay. This was, manifestation of something off in his mind. And the police, this didn't really answer all their questions, but it was sort of a relief. It seemed like, this sort of generally answers a very complicated and confusing situation. Basically, this was enough for the Baltimore PD to stop investigating, although they didn't actually officially close the case, and tell Ray's wife, Allison, and her family that Ray's death, as bizarre as it is, even though we don't really know how it happened, what we do know is that it most likely was a suicide. But Allison was not satisfied with this explanation. Because one, it still didn't answer the question of where Ray had fallen from. That seemed like an important thing to answer. And two, she didn't think Ray was mentally ill, and she was certain he had not killed himself. Allison's theory was that her husband was murdered, very likely because of his job. Here he is parading around like he's got great investment advice and he's pumping out his tips into that newsletter, that she knows and he knows are basically fraudulent. He doesn't know anything about investing. The opportunity to basically screw over subscribers was pretty high. People are taking his advice and they could be losing money because of it. And so it seemed entirely possible that somebody who was disgruntled over his bad advice came after him. And then also adding to the idea that this was not, self-harm, that something bad happened to Ray from an outside source. There was that strange phone call that Claudia, the friend, overheard him have when he said, "Oh shit," and then ran out the house. The police were able to trace that particular call back to Stansberry and Associates, the investment firm where Ray worked. But they were never able to figure out who had placed it or why. Because as soon as detectives began asking questions of this firm, Stansberry and Associates hired attorneys and told its employees not to speak about what happened to anyone, not even the police. And so to this day, Ray's case remains officially unsolved. But somewhere out there is the person who placed that final phone call to Ray. This person must know why Ray ran out of his house in a panic that night, and they might even know how he died or who killed him. But as of now, that person has not come forward. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have hundreds of videos for you to binge right now. But if you're looking for a recommendation from me of that one video that's worth your time, it's this one right here. So give it a watch. All right, until next time, see ya. One September afternoon in Taiwan, a young man boarded a public bus for what he thought would be just an ordinary ride home. But it wasn't that. This ride would turn out to be the single most terrifying experience of this guy's life. And we don't just have to take his word for it, because this young man managed to capture a photo of the thing that was terrorizing him on this bus for hours. And so no matter what you think of the story, the picture is fascinating. So make sure you stick around till the end to see that photo. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place, because that's all we do, and we upload once a week. So if that's of interest to you, on garbage collection day, wake up really early, go to the Like Button's house, and take their full trash cans away from the curb and put them back in their yard, wait for the garbage trucks to come by, and then after they're gone, wheel the Like Button's garbage bins back out to the curb. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't On the afternoon of September 4th, 2017, a young man named Zhu rushed through a bus station in southern Taiwan. Zhu's bus home to the capital city, Taipei, would be leaving any minute now, and because Zhu was running late, he knew the bus would be packed and he would get a terrible seat. And so Zhu just kept on running as fast as he could, and he finally saw his bus parked up against the curb on the outside of this bus station, and he ran up to it, totally winded, but glad that he hadn't missed his bus. And so the driver noticed Zhu standing there, and so he opened up the bus doors, and Zhu went on board, handed the driver his ticket, and the driver said, "Okay, take your seat." And Zhu turned, and he began walking down the aisle, and at first he almost didn't register the weirdness of the inside of this bus. I mean, he took this route all the time, and he was totally expecting this bus to be packed, but as he was walking down the aisle, he realized he was the only one on the bus. There was literally nobody else. It was just Zhu and the driver. And so for a second, Zhu thought maybe he had made a mistake and this was not his bus, but he checked his watch and, again, he had taken this bus many times and he knew this was it. And so he was about to turn and maybe ask the bus driver, but the bus driver shut the doors, turned on the engine, and began to pull away. And so Zhu just thought, well, I guess it's just my lucky day. I have the bus to myself. This is crazy. And so Zhu found a seat towards the front of the bus, and after sitting down and kind of getting situated, he just sat there and stared out the window as the driver, merged into traffic and eventually found their way onto the highway. And as they were just coasting along, Zhu really felt content. I mean, it really felt like he had this private ride all to himself, and this was not a short bus ride. It was like a 6-hour bus ride. And so the idea of just having peace and calm the whole time, I mean, that was so luxurious and unexpected. And so Zhu was just having a wonderful time, just kind of taking it all in. when all of a sudden he hears a woman coughing behind him. And remember, he's scanned the bus. It's empty. And so he whipped his head around, totally startled, like maybe there was somebody on the bus, but he looked behind him and there was no one. And so very quickly, Zhu began to rationalize what he had just heard. He's looking around thinking, okay, one of the windows is slightly open. Maybe the wind was coming in weird and causing a sound, or maybe it wasn't behind me. Maybe that cough came from the driver and somehow I thought it was back here. Zhu's telling himself that wasn't really a woman coughing because there's nobody here. And so before long, Zhu convinced himself that, that was just an anomaly. It was nothing to worry about. And he was back to just relaxing and enjoying this peaceful ride. And pretty soon after that, he began to drift off to sleep. A few hours later, Zhu woke up and he was very groggy, and he looked out the window and saw it was dark, and he checked his watch and saw they were maybe about halfway to their destination. And then he looked at his phone and saw he had a text message from the friend he had just been visiting, the friend he had been with before he left and got on this bus. And the friend was basically asking Zhu how the ride home was going. And Zhu, he wrote back and said, you won't believe this. I'm on a bus that's completely empty. Like, I have the bus to myself. And this friend, who was familiar with how packed this particular ride to Taipei was like, no way, that bus is never not filled with people. You gotta send me proof. And so Zhu opened the camera on his phone, he turned around, and he snapped a photo of the back of the bus. But when he looked at the photo he had taken, it was very grainy, and there wasn't any light in the bus, and there wasn't a flash on his phone. And so instead, Zhu, who happened to be a semi-professional photographer, he pulled out his really nice high-quality digital camera out of his bag, and with that camera, he turned around and took a photo. But when Zhu looked at the photo he had just taken, he thought there was something wrong with it. And so he zoomed in on the photo and he couldn't believe what he was looking at. And so he checked all the settings of his camera and checked the lens to make sure everything was working properly, and it was. And so starting to get kind of scared, Zhu put the camera down and walked to the back of the bus and walked up and down a couple of times looking for some explanation of what was in that photo. But there was no explanation, and so now feeling really scared, Zhu went back to his seat, grabbed his phone to text his friend to be like, look what I found, but his phone was dead. Even though his phone had full battery like a minute ago, now his phone doesn't work and he can't turn it back on. And so Zhu's thinking, what do? Do I tell the bus driver about this photo? But he was worried if he showed the driver, it would be so startling that the driver might crash the bus. And so Zhu really felt completely alone and terrified, and he just placed his camera next to him and then just closed his eyes and began silently praying that he would get off this bus. But as he was doing that, he began to hear whispering right behind him, like numerous people whispering right behind him, and he whipped his head around, but again, there's nobody there. And so now, the fear is only getting more and more heightened inside of Zhu. He goes back to praying, and now, in addition to the whispers behind him, he starts to hear the sound of seats basically creaking as if somebody's sitting in them, kind of rocking back and forth. And now Zhu, he's too scared to turn around, and so he just keeps on praying, and the noise behind him, this cacophony of sounds, is getting louder and louder. And finally, Zhu looks up at the driver, hoping the driver can hear the stuff, to confirm that Zhu's not losing his mind here. But the driver looked like he was just paying attention to the road, completely oblivious to what was happening inside of this bus. And so Zhu is horrified, has no idea what to do. These noises are not stopping, despite the fact nobody else is on this bus. And so Zhu finally plugged his ears just so he wouldn't hear it, and just tucked himself down in a ball and just continued to pray for the next 3 hours, all the way until the bus finally stopped. And when the bus stopped, Zhu unplugged his ears and opened his eyes, expecting to hear all these whispers and sounds, but the bus sounded totally quiet and normal. And the bus driver, was kind of going through the shutdown procedures of the bus. They were in the Taipei bus station. And so Zhu was feeling totally relieved here, and he couldn't wait to get off this bus. And so Zhu, he grabbed his camera and his things, packed them all up, and then as quick as he could, he began walking towards the front of the bus. But before Zhu got off the bus, the driver stopped him because he saw, Zhu looked horrible. He was sweating profusely. His skin was flushed. He looked like, something bad had just happened to him. And he asked Zhu, like, hey, are you okay? And Zhu was about to be like, oh, no, everything's fine, and just kind of get off the bus. But then he thought to himself, I have no explanation for what just happened, and that was horrifying. I don't know what that was. And I took this photo that I can't explain too, that seems definitely connected to all the noises I just heard. And now that the bus has stopped, there's no risk of showing the driver and risking scaring him so badly that we crash. And so Zhu thought, you know what, even if it makes me look crazy, I'm going to show the driver this photo and see what he thinks. And so Zhu was like, actually, let me show you something. So he pulls out his camera and he shows the driver the photo. And as the driver is kind of looking at the photo, not really sure what to look for, he reaches down and he zooms in on the top half of the photo, and it expands the ceiling of the back of the bus. And you can very clearly see there is a huge human arm and hand extending off the ceiling, like it's reaching down into the bus. And so as the bus driver is studying this arm and hand, Zhu is saying, I thought for a second that could have been me, reflected off the ceiling or something, but I was holding the camera in my hand, and so wouldn't the camera be in the reflection? If that's my arm, wouldn't the camera be visible? Because it's not. And then Ju also was like, I thought for a second maybe it was your arm, but you're driving the bus. Your hands are on the steering wheel. And so if this arm is your hand, wouldn't the steering wheel be in the reflection? Like, I don't understand how there's an arm with nothing in the hand reaching down from the ceiling. And then Ju also told the driver that in addition to this totally terrifying photo of this ghost arm coming off the ceiling, there were all these weird whispers and sounds and noises behind him for the whole ride. Like, it was horrifying. And so after Ju has detailed to this bus driver that basically your bus is haunted and I have photo proof, Ju is expecting the driver to have a pretty big reaction to this. I mean, geez, this is pretty big news here. But the driver just handed the camera back to Ju and basically turned to Ju and said, you know what? You can't show this photo to anybody. Like, no one can know about what happens on my bus, because if they find out, it'll ruin my business. And Ju's thinking, wait a minute, does this mean the bus is haunted? Is that what the bus driver is confirming here? He doesn't seem shocked. He seems like this is completely routine. This is what happens on his bus. And Ju was about to protest and be like, are you kidding me? Like, why aren't you telling people about what's happening on your bus? But then Ju was like, you know what? I don't know this guy. I don't care about this bus. You know what? I'm done with this. And so he said to the driver, don't worry, I won't tell anyone about, your haunted bus. I won't show anyone this photo. Thank you. And then Ju got off the bus. When Ju finally got to his house, it was around midnight and Ju was exhausted. So he goes inside, he lays on his couch and he plugs his phone in because his phone was dead. And as soon as his phone turned on, he saw all these messages from his friend who had asked him to send proof that the bus he was on was really empty. And so Ju wanted to tell his friend about all the crazy stuff that had happened on the bus. He wanted to send him that photo of, the ghost arm. But also Ju had promised the bus driver not to share this information with anyone because it could destroy this guy's business. And so as he was sitting there kind of wondering how to respond, something caught Ju's attention outside. And so he turned and looked out the window and he saw all these people walking down the road carrying red lanterns. And suddenly, everything sort of clicked for Ju. It was September 5th, which is important because it marked the beginning of a big event in Taiwan known as the Hungry Ghost Festival, and the people Ju saw outside walking around with red lanterns were clearly participating in this event. This festival is celebrated every year in Taiwan, and it's all about honoring the dead and feeding them with offerings. For example, people will burn fake money they call ghost money, and once it gets burned, the spirits of the dead can use that money during the ghost month. People in Taiwan believe that during this ghost month, the gates of heaven and hell open up, and spirits come out and walk the earth alongside all the living, which could be a great thing. If you have a dead loved one or friend or somebody, you can reconnect with them during this event, but it also can be a bad thing because sometimes angry spirits emerge from the gates of hell and they wreak havoc on the living. And so as soon as Ju realized that, today was the start of this Hungry Ghost Festival, he realized why the day before when he was on that bus, he realized why it was empty. Because there's this superstition in Taiwan that September 4th, the day before this festival, is the day when all the spirits are traveling around the globe. And it's believed that that day is a very dangerous day for the living to be out and about, because you don't want to come in contact by accident with, one of the evil spirits. And so nobody travels on September 4th. But Ju had just forgotten and just believed he had struck luck by having this empty bus. But then, as Ju was kind of working this through in his mind, he was thinking, wait a minute, all that weird stuff on the bus, the whispers, the sounds, the ghost arm reaching out of the ceiling that he got on camera, Was that some sign that he had just come in contact with an evil spirit? Was he now in danger? Was this spirit gonna follow him around and haunt him? He didn't know. But now he's thinking, oh my goodness, I did the thing I wasn't supposed to do, and now I could be paying the consequences for it. And so Zhu suddenly was like, you know what? I don't care that I made some promise to the bus driver about not disclosing this photo or what I experienced on the bus, because now this is like a me problem. Like, I could have big issues here. And so he decided he would send this photo to his friend and tell his friend about what he experienced on the bus to see what his friend thought. And so after messaging his friend wrote back that he was horrified by that photo, seeing that arm reaching down out of the ceiling. That was horrifying. And his friend didn't know what to make of it and did agree that, given the fact that the Hungry Ghost Festival has just started and you were out there on the day before, this isn't good. You could have come in contact with an evil spirit here. But his friend also gave Zhu some advice of how to handle this. He told Zhu to take that photo and post it on Facebook. Now that sounds kind of goofy, but in Taiwan, there's this belief that if you have bad luck, the best way to deal with bad luck is to basically dilute that bad luck by sharing it with other people. It's kind of like those old email forwards that people used to pass around, like, hey, forward this email along to 5 other people or else you'll have bad luck. It was kind of like that. Like, just share it with the world and, pass on your bad luck to other people, basically. And so Zhu's friend told Zhu, look, I know this isn't really bad luck we're dealing with here, but maybe if you just share this with the world, dilute what happened to you, maybe that will reduce the power this ghost has over you. It's worth a shot. And so Zhu posted the photo to Facebook, and it pretty much immediately went viral. Millions of people saw it, and this is what Zhu wanted. He wanted, max dilution here, show it to everybody to reduce the chances that this, entity can hurt him. But after all these people saw it, lots of people were spooked, and they began messaging Zhu, not like, don't worry, it's diluted now, but instead they were like, hey man, you're in trouble. This thing's gonna come after you. You need to seek real help here. You're in danger. And so this ended up freaking out Zhu more than the photo did in some way. It just made the whole situation feel far more real. And so Zhu ended up deleting the photo on Facebook, setting his Facebook to private, and basically staying off social media. And then he just kind of hoped and prayed that if he did nothing and just stayed home and kind of minded his own business, that he'd be okay. And after a few days, when nothing did happen, ultimately he just told himself, I'm okay. There's no ghosts here. I'm fine. But exactly 1 week after Zhu had got off the bus, so September 11th, 2017, Zhu is in his house, he's laying on the couch, not really thinking about what had happened on the bus, and as he's scrolling social media, he comes across this headline about this horrible accident out on the highway not far from where he lived. And it was this one vehicle that got into this huge wreck, and 6 people were killed and 11 others were injured. I mean, it's this horrible, horrible accident. And as Zhu is reading the article and scrolling down, he comes across a photo of the driver of this vehicle who's covered head to toe in blood. He looks totally haggard. He's standing out on this dark highway. And Zhu realizes the driver of the vehicle was the bus driver from when he had that horrible experience on the bus. It's the same guy. And so Zhu's like, oh my gosh, what's going on here? He scrolls down and he realizes the vehicle that crashed was the exact same bus he had been riding in when all this stuff happened. It was the same bus driver, same bus on the exact same route that this accident happened. And so obviously this is like a horrifying coincidence. Zhu very likely was thinking, I'm so lucky this didn't happen when I was on the bus. But when you take into context what Zhu experienced on that bus just a week earlier, the photo, the sounds, all of it, this story gets even weirder. Because the official story is the driver was negligent, and that's what caused the crash. That's it. And he actually went to jail for negligence. But there's video footage taken from inside of the bus right before it crashed, and in the final 30 seconds, something strange happens. The driver does not seem distracted at all, he's just driving along, but then something catches his attention, something off to his side. And you can tell right away he notices whatever this thing is, and he's turning, he's looking at this thing, he's not really paying attention to the road, and he starts reaching down. I mean, he's interacting with something in the bus, and you can't see it on camera. And as he gets more and more into dealing with whatever's happening over here, the bus crashes. Now, the driver never gave any public testimony about what was going on right before he crashed. All we have is the fact that it crashed, and this video footage, and Zhu's experience and that photo he took. And when you put it all together, it really makes you wonder if there was any truth to there really being some evil spirit on that bus that maybe did cause this crash. Or is it just a series of unexplainable coincidences? You be the judge. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have hundreds of videos for you to binge right now. But if you're looking for a recommendation from me of that one video that's worth your time, well, it's this one right here. So give it a watch. All right, until next time, see ya. Today's story is about a murder, but it starts to feel like it's sort of a typical true crime case until you get to the end. I'm telling you right now, you will not be able to guess who the mastermind was. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload 2, 3, even 4 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, late on the night of October 13th, 2008, a 43-year-old woman named Hua Saihui sat in her parked car in a dark, desolate area off the side of Highway 61 in New Taipei City, Taiwan. Hua rolled down her driver's side window and then turned the engine off. And for a second, she just sat there and let the warm breeze blow in on her face. It wasn't often that she got a moment alone because she had 3 kids who all lived at home. So she just took a moment to enjoy the silence. And then eventually, she turned to the center console and she grabbed a piece of paper that was sitting there. And she tore the paper into tiny pieces and then tossed them out the open window. But when she did that, she didn't realize that the breeze kind of blew back in at the same time, and a few of those ripped up pieces actually found their way back inside of her car and settled in the pocket on the driver's side door. A little while later, around 3 a.m., a Coast Guard officer drove along Highway 61 doing his regular nighttime patrol. He went under an overpass and into an area where there weren't very many streetlights. And there, in the relative darkness, he saw something that was pretty odd. There was this gray sedan parked half on and half off the road. Intrigued, the Coast Guard officer pulled up behind the car, parked, and got out to investigate. The sedan's lights and engine were both off, and so the officer wondered if maybe this car had been abandoned. But as he got closer, he saw that the driver's side window was wide open. Now again, it was pretty dark, but the officer could make out the shape of what appeared to be a woman sitting inside the car in the driver's seat. And so the Coast Guard officer took out his flashlight to wake this person up, but when he shined the light into the car, he immediately reeled back in horror, because the woman was not asleep. Her entire head and her chest were covered in blood. A few minutes later, a police officer named Guo Hui-wen arrived on the scene along with a small team of other police officers and several EMTs. The EMTs quickly determined what basically everybody on scene already knew, which was the woman inside the car was dead. She had a small circular wound right below her left ear that authorities immediately recognized as a bullet wound. Officer Guo immediately pushed his men out to secure the scene. And then once the cordon was in place, they began investigating. The first thing Guo did was just to look more closely at the woman's body. He saw there was a bullet casing on the ground nearby, and also what appeared to be some bullet fragments in the car, like little bits of shiny metal, like copper. But there was no gun. And so at this point, Officer Guo and his team realized they were very likely dealing with a murder. But as he stood there sort of taking it all in and looking at the car and the body, he started to realize that the whole scene just seemed off. First, there were no skid marks behind the car's tires, so it appeared like the woman must have pulled over in a controlled way, not like she'd been, forced off the road by another car. Second, her window was all the way down. The driver's side window was completely down, which meant either she'd been driving with the window down to begin with, or after she had pulled over, or while pulling over, she had rolled it down. And then thirdly, there was no evidence of a struggle, or really any sign that this woman had been panicked in any way before she was ultimately shot. I mean, she hadn't even dropped her phone or taken off her seatbelt. And so overall, it just sort of seemed like this woman had been remarkably calm in her final moments, like she had no idea she was about to be killed. and this made Officer Guo think that whoever shot her was very likely somebody she knew and trusted. And so Guo knew he needed to identify this woman and then determine who was close to her. So he took down the license plate number of the car, and he was about to go run it through a system to see who the car belonged to, but suddenly another officer came running over, and they told him they'd found something really weird inside the car. They weren't sure if what they found was related to the crime, but in the pocket on the driver's side of the door, they'd found 4 small scraps of paper, and each scrap had what looked like numbers or word fragments handwritten on them. They said 65, Dao Leo, Z, and Da. Now, none of these fragments appeared to have any meaning on their own. They likely, needed to be a part of a bigger piece of paper to make sense. In fact, honestly, the words were just pieces of words rather than actual full words themselves. And also, when they began sort of arranging the 4 pieces to see if they could, find meaning in these words and this number, they couldn't do it. It just was all sort of nonsense. And so Officer Guo, he figured these scraps were likely just garbage, but as a precaution, he had his officers bag them up as evidence just in case. Let's take a moment to say thank you to our sponsor, Sherwin-Williams. Choosing a paint color can be easy when you have the right tools. Sherwin-Williams offers several solutions for finding the perfect hue, including color chips, peel and stick samples, and color to go samples, so you can try color before you buy and find your perfect color with confidence. Your neighborhood Sherwin-Williams store delivers color and project expertise, a product for every need, and personalized customer experience. So my wife and I have been renovating our basement to make it our primary hangout space for the family. And in the basement is a custom entertainment center that we had installed, and it was supposed to get painted by professional painters, until my wife said, well, hey, why don't we make this our big project over spring break to paint it ourselves? Now, of course, I was thrilled, as any good husband would be, and so what we did is we went to our local Sherwin-Williams store, and let me tell you, the entire experience really was awesome. The staff was very knowledgeable, and they helped us pick the right paint color and finish, the amount of paint, all the supplies we would need, and they even gave us some how-to painting tips. And so my wife and I get home from Sherwin-Williams, and we start our one-day project that quickly evolved into a multi-day project. But at the end of those days, it came out great, and we could not have done it without the help of Sherwin-Williams. And now the entertainment center in the basement is the focus piece of the room, and I can proudly say we did that thanks to Sherwin-Williams. Head to swsamples.com to order color samples for your next project. Everyday life is full of moments that you plan for, and also moments that just happen, often when you least expect them. Whether it's part of your normal routine or something unexpected, Amazon is where you go for everyday essentials, making shopping simple and dependable. From running out of household basics to last-minute surprises, Amazon's great deals and low prices on everyday essentials make it easier to handle whatever life throws your way. Everything is in one place, so there's no extra stress or jumping through hoops when time is already tight. Whether it's something you buy regularly or something you suddenly realize you need right now, Amazon makes it easy to find what you're looking for quickly and at a price that feels good. It's straightforward, dependable shopping that makes everyday moments feel more manageable with less stress, fewer steps, and more confidence that your money is well spent. Shop Amazon and save on essentials. Save the everyday. A few hours later, Officer Guo, along with a member of his team, walked into this huge apartment complex in New Taipei City that was about 40 miles away from where they had found the woman inside of the gray sedan earlier that morning. They went to a specific apartment and they knocked on the door. And after a moment, a middle-aged man opened the door up, and he looked very surprised to see police standing at his door. Officer Guo asked this man if his name was Xu Bicheng, and the man nodded and said yes. By this point, Officer Guo and his partner had identified the murder victim. She was 43-year-old Hua Sai-hui. And when they'd started looking into Hua's relationships, they'd learned that she lived in this apartment with her 3 kids and the man who had opened the door, Xu Bicheng. He was her ex-husband. Even though the couple had actually gotten divorced 5 years earlier, they had ultimately decided to continue living together and co-parenting. As Hua's ex-husband, Xu was an obvious person of interest in this murder. But at this point, Officer Gua wasn't sure how much Xiu even knew. So he had to be careful how he approached the conversation. Officer Gua started by introducing himself and his partner, and then asked Xiu if he had spoken to his ex-wife recently. And Xiu shook his head and said he actually hadn't spoken to her since the previous night. But he did say that their last conversation had definitely been kind of weird. He said that the previous night, around 8:45 p.m., Hua had left to go to this meeting with a pawn shop owner on the opposite side of the city. He said that she owed this pawn shop owner a lot of money, and they were supposed to be discussing a repayment plan. But around 9:30 p.m., while she was on her way to this meeting, Xiu said that Hua had actually called him to say she was out on Highway 61 and another car was now following her. Xiu had told her that very likely this was just somebody driving a similar route as her, like this was not a cause for concern. And so ultimately, Hua had sort of agreed and said okay and hung up. And according to Xiu, he tried calling Hua back a bit later, but she hadn't picked up. Xiu said he actually called Hua an additional 10 more times after this, but she never answered, and so Xiu said he really didn't know what became of his ex-wife. He didn't know how the meeting went, he didn't know where she was. Now, after hearing this, Officer Gua's first reaction was sort of to be like, that's absurd. You know, if Xiu knew that Hua was potentially being followed, at night no less, while she's out by herself, going to this relatively high-stakes meeting with this pawn shop owner, and then she suddenly stops answering her phone, why wouldn't Xiu have eventually called the police? Or at least tried to go look for her? Instead, he'd just called Hua a bunch of times, and then when she didn't answer, he just shrugged the whole thing off. You know, the mother of his kids, he just sort of said, oh, no big deal. It just felt like a really bizarre way for somebody to react to this situation. So, Officer Gua watched Xiu very carefully as he told him, what happened. He said he was very sorry, but early that morning, they'd found his ex-wife murdered inside of her car on the side of the highway. When Xiu heard this, his eyes went wide and he began to tremble. And, from Gua's perspective, it looked like sort of a shocked response, a genuine shocked response that he can't believe what he's being told. But he also really couldn't read the guy. He couldn't tell if this was genuine or if he was just performing. Either way, Gua knew what he needed to do next was follow up on Xiu's story and see if maybe he could poke some holes in it. Following this interview, Gua and his team asked the manager of the apartment complex for any available surveillance footage so they could see if Hua really did leave the apartment when Xiu said she did. And the manager was able to recover some footage from inside the apartment complex elevator. And while it did prove that Hua left around 8:45 p.m., like Xiu had said, it also showed something else that struck Officer Gua as kind of strange. In the video, Hua rode down the elevator, supposedly on her way to meet with this pawn shop owner, but for some reason, her ex-husband, Xiu, rode the elevator with her. And during this ride, Xiu kissed Hua for 8 seconds straight, and then hugged her until the elevator stopped and the doors opened. Now, to most people, this would just look like a sort of normal, tender moment between a loving couple. But it was odd in this case, really for 2 reasons. First, because Hua and Xiu were divorced. As far as Gua understood, they were definitely not a romantic couple at all anymore. And then secondly, it was also weird because in Taiwanese culture, public displays of affection are very taboo, especially among older generations. Like, it would be really uncommon for a middle-aged couple to kiss and hug pretty much anywhere except inside their own home. So, Officer Gua felt like, the only reason that made sense for Xiu to behave the way he had on the elevator was if he knew something bad was about to happen to his ex-wife. And as they continued investigating Xiu's story, they found more problems with it. They learned that the pawn shop owner did exist, and Hua did owe him a lot of money, but when they actually spoke to him, he said he had not been planning to meet with Hua on the night of her death. He didn't know what Xiu was talking about. Police also got access to surveillance footage from Highway 61, where Hua's body had been found. Now, the cameras didn't cover the part of the road where the murder actually took place, but police were able to get footage of Hua driving along the highway at 9:30 p.m., the time Xiu said she had told him she was being followed. But on this video, there was clearly no other car following Hua. Now, it was technically possible that Hua had lied to her ex-husband Xiu for some reason, but to Officer Gua, it seemed much more likely that Xiu was now lying to him and making up, the story about the car following his ex-wife. After learning all of this, Officer Gua and his team went back and looked at all the surveillance footage from the apartment complex, and they also got access to Xiu's cell phone GPS records to see if they could track his movements on the night of the murder. But what they found really only complicated things, because according to the footage and Xiu's cell phone pings, he was inside of his apartment all night. There was no way he was the one who shot Hua. But to Officer Gua, this didn't mean Xiu was innocent. He wondered if maybe Xiu had hired someone to commit the murder on his behalf. He didn't know, but he just felt like Xiu had to be involved. But that theory still left a lot of unanswered questions. Like, why would Xiu have wanted Hua dead in the first place? And why would Hua have calmly pulled over and opened her car window for a hitman potentially? And so Officer Gua thought about it for a little bit, and then he had an idea. Maybe the person Xiu hired wasn't a stranger. Maybe the hitman was somebody Hua knew and trusted. Several months later, Officer Gua and one of his teammates were sitting inside of an office in a high-rise building in New Taipei City. They were in front of this huge desk, and behind this desk was the man who worked in this office. And he was Hua's brother. So Officer Gua and his team were still working off the idea that whoever killed Hua likely knew her personally. So they'd spent the last few months methodically tracking down and interviewing everyone in her cell phone contacts list. Now, so far, they had not found any new suspects. But they had learned some pretty interesting stuff. Apparently, Hua had not just been in debt to that pawn shop owner. She also owed money to multiple banks, to friends, to family members. She even owed money to some very shady black market lenders. Altogether, she had the equivalent of nearly $500,000 in debt. And knowing all of this actually made Hua and her ex-husband Xiu's relationship make more sense. Several people had told Gua that the reason Hua and Xiu had gotten divorced was not because they wanted to. It was because Hua's credit was terrible because of all this debt, and Xiu wanted to keep his finances separate from hers. And so by all accounts, the couple, despite being divorced, were still very much in love, and they were both devoted to each other and to their kids. And so this new information had kind of left Officer Gua and his team floundering, because Xiu had initially seemed so suspicious, but Gua still didn't have any hard evidence against him, and now he didn't even seem to have a motive for him. So now, as Gua sat inside of this office across from Hua's brother, he just hoped that some new piece of information would come to light. Gua and his partner asked the brother to please tell them everything he knew about Hua, her marriage, and anything else he thought might be relevant. The brother nodded and started talking. But pretty quickly, what he was saying just sounded a lot like all the other stuff that Gua already knew. Like, this was not new information, it was the same as always. And so as the brother just kind of began to talk, Gua's eyes sort of left the brother and began wandering around the room. And eventually, Gua's gaze landed on a bookshelf behind the brother, behind the desk. He noticed there was a piece of paper sticking out from between two books on this shelf. Now, Gua could only see a little bit of it, but he could tell that there was handwriting on the paper that looked familiar. And so, without saying anything, like while the brother is still talking, Gua got up, walked around to the bookshelf, and he pulled out that piece of paper. And right away, as he's looking at it, his heart began to race, because he saw that the handwriting on this piece of paper was the same handwriting that were on those 4 little scraps of paper that were found at the crime scene, those pieces of paper that were sort of ruled out as trash. He's seeing this is definitely the same handwriting. But more than that, Gua is seeing that literally the actual words or portions of words and the number that were on those fragments are literally on this piece of paper. Clearly, he's looking at a duplicate of whatever document was in the car that got ripped up. He only had 4 little pieces before. Now he's looking at the full copy of that document. And as Gua looked over this document, it was like everything just snapped into place. Those fragments that he saw, those things that were found in the car that now have been laid out in this document, those were bits and pieces of street names and addresses. The full message that Gua was now looking at was actually a set of geographical directions. And the directions would lead whoever was following these directions to the actual location where Hua was murdered. And so after this discovery, the police very quickly figured out what happened to Hua, like who the mastermind was behind her murder. But amazingly, the mastermind was not Hua's brother, despite this document being found in his office. No, it would turn out that the story of Hua's murder was far darker and far more tragic than anybody could have imagined. It all began 1 month before Hua's death. That was when 3 people who all wanted Hua dead met up. That was Hua's brother, Hua's ex-husband, and the mastermind. And the 3 of them, once they got together, they began formulating a plan. Now, what they all decided was none of them wanted to get their hands dirty, so they would hire a hitman. They decided that once they had this hitman, they would kill Hua in a neutral location. They would shoot her on the side of the highway. And they chose a date for her execution that was convenient, a time when that section of the road would be basically empty and also was an area where there were no cameras and few streetlights. And so on the night that Hua is going to be executed, the reason Hua's ex-husband, Xiu, rode down the apartment elevator with her and hugged her and kissed her in this big display of affection was because he knew what was going to happen to her. He was basically saying goodbye. And then after Hua left the apartment, Xiu contacted Hua's brother, who then called the hitman. And then the hitman used the directions the brother had written out for him, those same directions that Gua had found in his office. The hitman used those to get to the location where they were going to kill Hua. And when he got there, he just pulled off to the side of the road and he waited. A little while later, the hitman saw Hua's gray sedan pass by him and come to a stop on the side of the road. And so at this point, the hitman got out of his car, he walked up alongside Hua's car, her window was down, he pulled out a gun, and he shot her. It would turn out the third person who met up with the ex-husband and the brother who wanted Hua dead, who was the mastermind behind Hua's execution, was Hua herself. The reason Hua had those directions in her car that she ultimately ripped up at the end and tried to dispose of is because she needed directions to go to the place where she was going to get killed. It's why the hitman got out of the car, walked right up and killed her with no fight. She had rolled down the window and was waiting. Police later determined that Hua had taken out a life insurance policy on herself that was worth so much money it would pay off all of her debt and leave her family with a lot of money left over. She'd planned her own murder as a sort of self-sacrifice in the hopes of giving her family a better life. She'd ultimately convinced her ex-husband and brother to help in exchange for a cut of the money. But her plan didn't really work out. Hua's death was ruled a suicide, not a homicide, so the life insurance company didn't pay out anything to her family. Xiu, Hua's brother, and the hitman all faced a number of charges, including facilitating suicide and fraud. They each received between 6.5 and 7 years in prison. Hey everyone, just a reminder, I'm going on tour this year, which means if you go, you can experience never before heard stories from me live and in person. We did this in 2024 and people loved it. So get your tickets today at tour.ballenstudios.com right now before they sell out. That's tour.ballenstudios.com. I can't wait to see you all at the shows. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have hundreds of videos for you to binge right now. But if you're looking for a recommendation from me of that one video that's worth your time, well, it's this one right here. So give it a watch. All right, until next time, see ya. One night in December of 2009, a man dug through a pile of papers and photo albums inside of an RV that was parked in Texas. The man had recently bought this trailer after its previous owner had died, and so now he was finding it was full of junk that he was trying to sort through. And as he rifled through the documents, he stumbled on a stack of old notebooks. He opened one and he began reading it, and as he did, he felt his heartbeat pick up, because the notebooks were actually diaries, and they were full of handwritten rantings about demons and monsters and a deal with the devil. But that wasn't what scared him. What really scared the guy was this writer's horrifying confession. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place, because that's all we do, and we upload 2, 3, even 4 times a week. So if that's of interest to you, please replace the like button shampoo with motor oil. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any. On the night of July 24th, 1987, 30-year-old Susan Woods stood at the entrance to a local fair in a little city called Hico, located in central Texas, along with her best friend and her best friend's boyfriend. And the three of them were standing there trying to decide if they wanted to continue to stay here or leave. Now, as they're standing there, they can hear people having fun on all the rides. There's kids laughing and they're screaming. I mean, it's a Friday night. They had chosen to come here. This was the activity. But, so far the night had really not been that great. So Susan's best friend, whose name was Cindy Hallmark, and her boyfriend, whose name was Roy Hayes, had convinced Susan to come out with them and come to this fair, because Susan's life of late had been really quite bad. She was in the middle of this very ugly divorce, and the new guy that she was dating had sort of wound up being very pushy when it came to physical intimacy, and so she had recently dumped him too. And so, Susan's life, certainly her relationships anyways, were sort of in rough shape. And so Cindy and Roy had convinced Susan to come out with them and just, at least for one night, come enjoy this fair. Just forget about everything else and just come have some fun. And so Susan had agreed to go. However, sort of ironically, once they actually got to the fair and the three of them were walking around and playing games and going into the haunted house and doing all the things you do at the fair, it had been Cindy, not Susan, who had ultimately said that they weren't really having a good time, that they were feeling kind of bad. Cindy said that she just had this really intense feeling that something bad was about to happen. It was like this constant anxiety, and she couldn't shake it, and it was making it really hard to enjoy the night. And so that was why the trio is, standing at the gate, wondering if it's even worth staying here any longer. And ultimately, Roy finally just said, you know what, why don't we just leave and head back to Stephenville? That's where they all lived. It's where they grew up, too. And he said, why don't we go back to Stephenville and we'll just drive around for a bit, and eventually we'll go to the Dairy Queen restaurant and we'll get some ice cream. And when Roy suggested this, both Susan and Cindy thought that was a great idea. And so they left, they hopped in Roy's truck, and they began the drive back to Stephenville. About an hour and a half later, Susan, Cindy, and Roy walked into the Stephenville Dairy Queen. They ordered ice cream sundaes and then sat down at a booth. By this point, Cindy's feeling of dread, that something bad was going to happen, had mostly gone away, and so the mood was much lighter. And Susan especially was actually having kind of a great night, the first in a long time it felt like. The last 6 months or so had been some of the worst in Susan's entire life. Her ex-husband, Michael Woods, who she had been with since she was in her early 20s, had effectively abandoned her back in February, taking her car and also some expensive crystals that she had collected, and he had left behind a viciously mean tape recording of all the things he hated about her, along with dozens of cruel notes with insults on them hidden all over the place. And so Susan had filed for divorce, and then instead of trying to get her car back from her husband, who was long gone, she just began doing a ton of overtime at the sandpaper factory in order to afford another car. And so in these few months immediately following the breakup with her ex and all this extra work she was doing, Susan had really fallen into a deep depression. But it had been Cindy and Roy who had helped kind of pull herself back together. Susan was naturally very shy, and she did not have a big social circle. But Cindy, on the other hand, was very extroverted, had a ton of friends, and a lot of close cousins. And so she had persuaded Susan to begin coming to their regular meetups with all her friends and cousins. The core group that typically attended these meetups was Cindy, Roy, Cindy's cousins, Regina and Scott Hatley, and then maybe one or two others. And collectively, they referred to themselves as the members of the round table, because often these meetups consisted of just spending the whole night sitting around Cindy's round kitchen table, talking and drinking. The first time Susan had gone, it had seemed like such a tight-knit group that she really just kind of felt like a third wheel and did not belong. But everyone had really treated her like she did belong. And these days, she did not miss a meetup because this was like her new community. It really made her happy. And so slowly but surely, Susan had begun to feel better, largely because of these meetups. And so now, as she looked across the table at Cindy, jokingly trying to force-feed Roy all this ice cream, Susan just smiled. Roy was this big guy, but he was losing the fight, and he had chocolate sauce all over his chin. They were just kind of goofing around. She just thought to herself, you know what? Tonight was a great night. My life, it's turning around. And suddenly, she had an idea. Susan stood up from the table, and without saying anything, she walked up to the counter, and she promptly ordered a second hot fudge sundae. And when she carried it back over to the table with a big grin on her face, Cindy and Roy kind of looked at her surprised, and were kind of impressed even, which was exactly the reaction that Susan was hoping for. Normally, Susan was very conscious of her weight and wouldn't even finish one sundae. But tonight, she just felt like, you know what? I have been set free. I'm just going to have fun. But unfortunately for Susan, the ice cream sundaes were really the last fun thing she got to enjoy that entire weekend, because she spent all day Saturday on the line at the sandpaper factory where she worked, and then all day Sunday she was grocery shopping, doing laundry, and straightening up the house. By about 8 p.m. Sunday night, she had put away all of her laundry, she had made the bed, and picked up the last few items off the bedroom floor. Her house was small, but it was finally starting to feel like hers again. When her ex-husband Michael had first left, even though he had gone 1,000 miles away to Indiana, she had felt afraid in her house, like he might suddenly come back. And so she'd actually had Cindy sleep over her house for a while to help her feel safe. And also she asked Roy to literally nail all her windows shut. But despite fortifying her living space, what Susan couldn't escape from were all these awful little notes that Michael had left behind and hidden all over the house. All these awful messages, just basically telling Susan all these terrible things about her and how much he hated her. She kept finding them all the time. But as of right now, the house was neat and tidy, and Susan by this point believed she had found, almost every note, or certainly close to every note. So, to celebrate, Susan headed over to the couch and sat down and turned on the TV. Her plan was just to watch a couple of shows and just enjoy the peace and quiet, and then go to bed, because tomorrow she would have to get up early for work. As she was sitting there, flipping through the channels trying to figure out what she wanted to watch, she heard a knock on the front door. Two days later, at 6 p.m. on the afternoon of July 28th, Susan's father, Joe Atkins, was at home when his phone rang. And when he picked it up, it was Susan's manager at the sandpaper factory, which was weird. The manager told him that he was calling because Susan had not shown up to work for the past 2 days, and nobody could get a hold of her. And so he was wondering if Joe knew where she was. Joe frowned and said no, he didn't know, but he would go find out. He hung up, and he immediately dialed Susan's number. And when she didn't answer, he didn't think twice. He just put the phone down, grabbed his keys, hurried out to his truck, and started driving towards Susan's place. A half an hour later, Joe pulled up outside of Susan's house, and he went up to her front door. And when he knocked, nobody answered. But he could hear the TV on inside. And when he tried the doorknob, he found the door was unlocked. He opened the door up a little bit, and he poked his head inside, and he called his daughter's name. But he didn't get a response. So he stepped all the way inside. The house was basically clean, except there were snacks out on the coffee table, and the TV was still on, and it was on pretty loud. But also, there were some cigarettes that had been burned out in an ashtray on the coffee table, and Joe knew his daughter didn't smoke. And so at this point, everything told him something is wrong. So Joe walked through the living room and into his daughter's bedroom. And his daughter was not in there, but the bed was a mess. The sheets and the bedding had all been ripped off and were sitting in a heap on the floor, and the mattress itself was hanging off the box spring. Joe was about to leave and search the rest of the house when he noticed the bathroom door in the bedroom was open. Joe forced himself to step toward the door, and as he did, his heart began to hammer in his chest. And then, when he leaned around the door and looked inside the bathroom, he just froze. For what felt like a very long time, but was very likely only a few seconds, Joe didn't move or breathe. Then, it's like he broke out of his fog, he stumbled backwards, he ran to the living room, grabbed the phone, and he called 911. Sergeant Donnie Hensley of the Stephenville Police Department had just gotten home after a pretty long shift when he got a call from dispatch to head back out again. A homicide had just been called in, and every available officer had to head to the scene right away. The dispatcher did not have many details, but they did know that the victim was a young woman and that she had been found by her father inside of her home. When Hensley got to the address, he found there was an ambulance there and a couple of fire trucks and police cars and a whole bunch of police officers that were already out and about stringing up crime scene tape. But he also saw someone that he was not expecting to see. It was a friend of his, a guy he knew who volunteered at the town's golf course. His name was Joe Atkins. So he walked over and he asked Joe, hey, what are you doing here? But the instant he asked that question, and when Joe turned around to look at him, Hensley understood why he was here. He suddenly remembered that Joe had a daughter, and based on the look on Joe's face, clearly his daughter was the murder victim. Joe had found her. Hensley was a hardened detective who had been to plenty of crime scenes by this point, and he had seen some terrible things. But the pure grief on his friend's face was too much for him to bear. He knew there was nothing he could do to take Joe's pain away. So instead, without saying anything, Hensley took Joe's hands, and the two men just stood there and prayed. And then after a few minutes, he let go of Joe's hands, and then he turned and walked up Susan's front steps to begin the search for her killer. The crime scene unit was already inside of Susan's home, hard at work, by the time Detective Hensley walked through the front door. A supervisor walked over and brought Hensley up to speed. They told him that Susan's body was in the bathroom, and from the looks of it, she'd been dead for a while. The front door had been unlocked, and there was no sign of forced entry, which suggested that Susan may have let her killer inside. Detectives were now dividing up the house into quadrants to examine each part of the crime scene, and Hensley would be working primarily in the bedroom. But the supervisor warned Hensley that the crime itself was incredibly brutal, likely bordering on torture, and he should just mentally prepare himself. Hensley nodded, and for a moment he just stood there and collected himself and took stock of the scene. He looked over at the coffee table in the living room, and he saw it was covered with snacks, including a bag of potato chips, a pack of Twinkies, and an open Coke can. And there was an ashtray with 6 cigarette butts inside of it. It looked like more food and more cigarettes than one person would reasonably consume, and so maybe Susan had had company. But otherwise, the house was clean and pretty unremarkable. Except for one thing that took Hensley a minute to notice. And what it was is all the windows were nailed shut from the inside. Susan clearly must have been scared of somebody breaking in. And so naturally, Hensley wondered if maybe the person she was scared of breaking in was the same person who wound up killing her. But if that was the case, why had she apparently opened the door for this person? At this point, Hensley moved into the bedroom. And as soon as he did, he could tell there had to have been a struggle in here. Because the mattress was hanging off the box spring, the sheets had been pulled off, and they were heaped up on the floor. And there were all these scuff marks on the floor that suggested the bed very likely had been moved, dragged around inside of the room. There was also a white extension cord lying on the mattress, and also there was this pillow that had all these strange black smudges on it. Hensley walked over and looked at this pillowcase, trying to figure out what the smudges could be, and then he realized it was mascara. The pillow must have been held over Susan's face to suffocate her. But when Hensley walked into the bathroom and saw what was in there, despite the warning he was given about how brutal it was, he still was taken aback and found himself gasping. Susan's body was draped over the side of the tub, with her head still in the water, At first glance, it was obvious Susan was dead because her head and shoulders that were underwater were severely decomposed from being in the water. And so at this point, Hensley realized that whoever murdered Susan had likely sexually assaulted her, strangled her, smothered her, and then held her body underwater. I mean, this had been a savage attack committed by a monster. However, Hensley also realized that this monster, whoever had done this, had made at least one mistake, because one of the crime scene techs that was in the bathroom was pointing at the tub with excitement. And when Hensley looked at what they were pointing at, you could see perfectly clearly there was a set of palm prints, almost certainly left behind by the killer. The following morning at around 10 a.m., Sergeant Hensley walked into the Stephenville police station and promptly filled up a paper cup from the bullpen water cooler and drank it down. It was over 90 degrees outside, and he had just spent all morning and a lot of the previous night canvassing the neighborhood where Susan had been murdered. But despite all their efforts, they really hadn't gotten much. Susan had been found on Tuesday, but nobody had reported seeing her on Tuesday or the Monday before or the Sunday before, which left a window of 3 days for this murder to have taken place. One of Susan's neighbors did remember seeing a, quote, large-framed man park his truck near Susan's house on Sunday night, but that described a lot of the men in Stephenville, so that didn't really narrow anything down. Now, the police chief had not yet assigned a lead investigator to Susan's case, but because Sergeant Hensley knew Susan's father personally, he was hoping to stay involved. So after drinking a second cup full of water, Hensley headed down the hall to the chief's office, where he asked to see Susan's autopsy report. The chief's secretary handed it over, and Hensley quickly began to thumb through the pages. But he quickly realized there really was almost nothing here that he didn't already know. The report confirmed that Susan had been sexually assaulted, but her body was so decomposed, it was impossible to determine exactly how or when she had died, although the coroner estimated she'd been in the tub for roughly 2 days. But right at that moment, another investigator named Lieutenant Ken Maltby walked up and grabbed the report right out of Hensley's hands. And before Hensley could protest, Maltby walked back to the bullpen and rapped his knuckles on a door frame to get everybody's attention. Then Maltby announced that he would be taking over Susan's case, so everybody else, Hensley included, should back off. And Hensley did not like this, not only because, he had this closeness with Susan's father, but also because he had a feeling that Maltby was only interested in this case because he thought it would help his career. However, Maltby outranked Hensley, and Hensley already had a full caseload of work, so there really was very little he could do here. So, with a resigned sigh, he headed back to his desk. Two days later, around 2 p.m. on July 31st, Sergeant Hensley stood in the back of a small crowd, sweating through his suit, as Susan's casket was lowered into the ground. Hensley was at this funeral really to support Susan's father, Joe, because he was not really a part of the investigation. However, he couldn't help, scanning the mourners, through a detective's lens to see if anybody seemed suspicious. There was a group of people in their 20s and 30s that were standing towards the front, and Hensley assumed they must be Susan's friends. He remembered what one of Susan's neighbors had said about a large-framed man, and he looked at all the men, taking note of their size. At the center of the group, there was a blonde woman who was sobbing, and Hensley recognized her as Susan's best friend, Cindy Hallmark, who was leaning on her boyfriend, Roy Hayes. The two of them had actually come to the crime scene by coincidence on the day Susan's body was found, and they had totally broken down when they realized what had happened. But now, Hensley was suddenly noticing just how physically enormous Roy was. And so in that moment, Hensley thought to himself, if he was in charge of this case, he knew Roy would be somebody he'd take a close look at. But that was not his decision. But then Hensley noticed that there was actually one person who was conspicuously absent from this funeral, and that was Susan's ex-husband, Michael Woods. From what Hensley had heard around the station, nearly all of Susan's friends and family were convinced that it was Michael who was the killer. But there was a problem with this theory. Michael lived 1,000 miles away in Indianapolis, and word around the police station was that during that window of time where Susan was murdered over those 3 days, Michael was in Indianapolis, and he was around loads of people who would vouch for him being in Indianapolis. which meant that, as far as Hensley knew, there really was no way for Michael to be the killer. And so Hensley just hoped that Lieutenant Maltby had another, better suspect in mind. For the next few weeks, Sergeant Hensley focused on his own cases, while still keeping tabs on Susan's. Every couple of days, her dad would call him up and ask why Michael hadn't been arrested yet, and Hensley would always tell him that the case was in good hands and they're working on it. But as the weeks passed by with no arrests, Hensley started to wonder, what was going on here? Something needs to happen. Why is nothing happening? Then one day in early October, so roughly 2 months after Susan's murder, Hensley walked into the bullpen to find Maltby celebrating. Not because of any progress in the case, though, but to celebrate his big promotion. Maltby was going to be the lead of a new narcotics unit, and his open cases that he had been working on were just going to be, given to other investigators or filed away altogether. And so as Maltby accepted congratulations from other officers and just made a whole scene, all Sergeant Hensley could think was, well, what's going to happen to Susan's case? It could easily fall through the cracks here. And so without even talking to Maltby, Hensley walked straight to the chief's office and asked to take the case over. The chief shrugged and just said, sure, you're welcome to try, so long as this case does not get in the way of his other work. Hensley agreed and then went to get Susan's file, and then after he had it in hand, he hurried back to his desk and began rifling through the pages. And he was stunned to find that there was almost nothing in there besides the original autopsy report. And that's when Hensley remembered that Lieutenant Maltby claimed to have this photographic memory, and so he almost never took notes. And so Hensley was basically going to have to start all over from square one. At 9 a.m. the next morning, Sergeant Hensley sat down in the kitchen of Susan's best friend, Cindy Hallmark, as Cindy poured them both a cup of coffee, and then Cindy started talking. And she had a lot to say. She was absolutely convinced that Susan's ex-husband, Michael Woods, was the killer, and she just could not understand why it was taking detectives so long to arrest him. Cindy said, for most of Susan and Michael's relationship, Michael was just kind of a loser. He couldn't keep a job, and he'd just lift weights and play guitars shirtless in the front yard. However, when they had broken up, Michael had recorded this totally unhinged audio recording about how awful Susan was and left it for Susan, along with all these notes he had hid all around the house and the property, which also just said terrible things about Susan. And this behavior by Michael had scared Susan so much that she had asked Cindy and Cindy's boyfriend Roy to help nail all her windows shut, specifically to prevent Michael from coming into the house. Hensley listened and wrote everything Cindy said down, but he really wasn't as sold on the Michael Woods theory as everybody else in Stephenville seemed to be. And that was primarily because the police in Indianapolis had spoken to Michael, and apparently he had given them a rock-solid alibi. And so realistically, it didn't make sense for him to be the killer. That said, Hensley was pretty confident that the killer had to be somebody Susan knew. The lack of forced entry, coupled with all the snacks and the Coke can and cigarettes on her coffee table, suggested that Susan might have entertained her murderer before they killed her. And so at this point, Hensley was much more interested in learning if there were other romantic interests in Susan's life, besides Michael. And when he asked Cindy that question, she said, yeah, there was one other guy. She said right before Susan was killed, she was seeing this bartender named J.C. Bauman. However, they'd only gone on a few dates. Cindy said that J.C. had put a lot of pressure on Susan to sleep with him, and so she had just broken up with him. And when Hensley heard this, he felt like this was really promising. And so when Cindy finished telling her J.C. story, he asked her if she knew where he could find J.C. And she said yeah, and she gave him the address of the bar where he worked. 45 minutes later, Sergeant Hensley pulled up in front of the bar. It was still too early for business, but there was a delivery truck out front, and there were a few men who were unloading kegs and bringing them inside. And so Hensley walked up to these guys, and he asked if any of them knew a J.C. Bauman. And this tall, bearded man raised his hand and said, actually, that was him. A few minutes later, Hensley and J.C. were sitting at the empty bar. Hensley watched J.C.'s face very closely as he explained to him that he was here to talk about Susan. J.C. nodded and ran his fingers through his hair like he was nervous. And then he said his throat was dry and asked Sergeant Hensley if he wanted something to drink. Sergeant Hensley said he was okay, but JC, he got up, went behind the bar, and then came back with a can of Coke. And after sitting down and opening the drink up and taking a sip, JC also lit up a cigarette. And so immediately, Hensley thought of the Coke can that was on Susan's coffee table, as well as the ashtray full of cigarettes, despite the fact that Susan was not a smoker. And so the interview had barely even started, and Hensley was already very suspicious of JC. So he decided to push pretty early and see how JC reacted under some serious pressure. And so right out the gate, he asked JC where he was on Sunday, July 26th, which was the day investigators at this point believed Susan was murdered, based primarily on the autopsy report. And when JC was asked that, he swallowed and said he couldn't remember, which was possible. I mean, the murder happened 2 months earlier, but it didn't make JC look that good. So Hensley asked JC if it was true that he and Susan broke up ultimately because he, JC, had pressured her for sex. JC turned beet red and said he had never pressured Susan. He said they had been intimate, but just once in Susan's bathtub. And when Hensley heard this, he nearly dropped his pen. It seemed extremely suspicious that JC was claiming to have been intimate with Susan in the same bathtub where she was found dead. And so Hensley wondered if he was maybe trying to get ahead of the fact that his fingerprints would be found on or in that bathtub. Now, legally, Hensley knew he could not compel JC to offer up his fingerprints without charging him first. But he took a chance and just asked anyway. And to his surprise, JC said, "Yes, you can have my fingerprints." And he almost seemed relieved. He said, "Whatever you need to help solve Susan's murder, I'll do it." 2 hours later, Sergeant Hensley was back at his desk in the Stephenville police station looking at a card that had JC's finger and palm prints on it. And as he looked at it, he began thinking about those palm prints on Susan's bathtub. In 1987, fingerprints and palm prints were just much slower to process than they are today. And the closest lab that analyzed these prints was an hour and a half away in Fort Worth. And Hensley knew they were always working with a backlog, so his results could easily take months. But Hensley was not going to just sit around and wait, because he had one more suspect he wanted to talk to. The following afternoon, Sergeant Hensley walked into an interrogation room at the police station and sat down across from Roy Hayes, who was Susan's best friend, Cindy's boyfriend. Hensley wanted to speak to Roy for 2 reasons. One, he matched the physical description of the large man seen near Susan's house around the time of her murder. And 2, there just weren't that many people who were close to Susan. And Roy saw her when she was both with Cindy and also when she would attend those members of the Round Table get-togethers. Now, that was not that incriminating, but Hensley knew that catching the killer was as much about ruling suspects out as it was about ruling them in. So that was really all he was trying to do here with Roy, is just maybe find a way to say, nope, not him. But before Hensley could even begin asking Roy questions, Roy just started talking. He told Hensley that he had been thinking about Susan's case nonstop. He said that his mind had been running wild with all the possible ways the killer could have gotten inside. And so now Roy was eager to share his theories. After all, he said he was the one who nailed those windows shut, so he knew where the weaknesses in her house were. And so Hensley said, "Okay, let's hear your theories." And Roy began listing all the ways a person might be able to get inside of Susan's house, including what Roy said was the most promising, which was a 6-inch crack in the window above the kitchen sink. And as Roy did this, all of a sudden, he was at the top of Hensley's suspect list. And when Roy was done rattling off all the ways he would break into Susan's house, Hensley asked him, "Where were you on the evening of Sunday, July 26th? And Hensley watched as Roy's expression changed from very intense to surprised, as he realized he was now being asked for his own alibi. Roy started stumbling over another very long, rambly answer, and what he had to say ultimately just made him look even more guilty. Because Roy told Hensley that on the night Susan was killed, he had been over at a friend's house playing a game called Dungeons and Dragons. So today, people know Dungeons and Dragons as a harmless fantasy role-playing game. But at this time in 1987, it was viewed very differently. In the late 1980s in America, there was this huge fear that certain games, books, and heavy metal songs were all linked to devil worship. The TV news ran regular stories across the country about how Dungeons & Dragons specifically encouraged players to cast spells and practice witchcraft. And the local paper in Stephenville had carried a full-page ad calling the game satanic. So when Roy told Hensley he had been playing Dungeons & Dragons on the night Susan was killed, Hensley immediately thought back to the horrible brutality of the crime scene. And he wondered if maybe Susan's murder could have been tied to some kind of dark ritual. And so Hensley looks at Roy and says, "Okay, well, are you prepared to give us your fingerprints?" And Roy said, "Yeah." A half an hour later, a very disappointed Sergeant Hensley watched Roy walk away from the station. Just like with JC, Roy had seemed incredibly suspicious at the start of the interview, but then he'd easily offered up his fingerprints like he wasn't concerned at all about whether they'd matched the killers. So Hensley was not sure what to expect in terms of results here. But he still sent Roy's prints off to the outside lab to be added to the queue behind JC's. Hensley was contemplating his next move when the station receptionist walked over and said that someone from the Indianapolis Metropolitan Police Department was on the line for him. They were following up on the inquiry he had made a few days earlier to double-check the alibi of Susan's ex-husband, Michael Woods. Hensley eagerly ran to the phone, and when he heard what the officer had to say, he practically jumped out of his chair. Because according to the Indianapolis police officer, it was true that Michael said he had an alibi with lots of witnesses, but he had promised to provide the names and contact information for all those witnesses, and he had never done it. Which meant Michael's alibi, the same one Stephenville police used to rule him out as a suspect, or more specifically, they used the idea of his alibi, the belief that his alibi existed, that's what they used to rule him out. Well, clearly, it was totally unverified. Lieutenant Ken Maltby, who was in charge of the case when this decision was made, had just completely dropped the ball. Somebody had to check Michael's alibi. On a bright morning in April of 1988, Sergeant Hensley walked out of the Indianapolis International Airport with a single duffel bag of luggage slung over his shoulder. He was here to try to collect the fingerprints of Susan's ex-husband, Michael Woods, who was now Hensley's primary suspect. Hensley had been trying to coordinate the investigation into Michael from Stephenville, Texas, but it had proven to be kind of cumbersome, and so he decided to just take matters into his own hands and actually go to Indianapolis. He knew Michael did not have to submit to fingerprinting unless he was charged with a crime, so Hensley had come up with a plan. He was going to put Michael under surveillance and wait for him to do something illegal. Maybe he gets into a fight or an altercation, or he buys some marijuana, or even jaywalked, anything. Hensley would use it as an excuse to arrest him and get his prints. For days, Hensley sat in an unmarked van outside the house where Michael lived, watching the front door through a telephoto camera lens. But Michael and his roommates seemed pretty boring. They barely even left the house. Hensley was beginning to think that his big plan to catch Michael doing something illegal was a huge waste of time. It just was not going to happen. But then one morning, he noticed some unusual activity in Michael's front yard. Michael and his roommates were laying out furniture and clothing on their front lawn, clearly getting ready for a yard sale. Sergeant Hensley was snapping photos of everything they were bringing out, and at one point, he saw something that gave him a rush of excitement. Because through his lens, he spotted these crystal figurines that appeared to be the exact same type of crystal figurines that Michael had allegedly stolen from Susan's house in Stephenville when their marriage had ended and he had left to go to Indianapolis. Hensley practically laughed out loud. I mean, this was too easy. This was his chance. So he called the local police, and they stormed the yard sale, and they arrested Michael for theft. 2 weeks later, now back in Stephenville, Sergeant Hensley walked into the police station to start a shift, and he found a manila envelope waiting for him. It had a return address that said it was from the Texas DPS Crime Lab in Fort Worth, Texas, where he had sent all of the suspect's fingerprints. Hensley ripped open the envelope and dumped the contents onto the table, and as he began looking through them, he realized the lab had already analyzed all 3 sets of prints that he had sent in. They were Susan's ex-boyfriend, J.C. Bauman, her best friend's boyfriend, Roy Hayes, and her ex-husband, Michael Woods. Now, at this point, if Hensley had had to guess who the killer was, he would have guessed Michael, because Michael is this estranged ex-husband who had left behind these terrible recordings and notes, and he had spooked Susan so badly at the end of their relationship, she had nailed her windows shut to keep him out. And then also, his alibi was sort of up in the air. They didn't really know if he had one or not. They hadn't been able to actually verify it or not yet. JC also had basically no alibi. He drank Coke and he smoked cigarettes, just like the killer had left in Susan's living room, or is believed to have been the killer who left those behind. And Roy, in virtue of playing Dungeons and Dragons, could potentially be involved in Satanism. And also, he seemed way too eager to talk about how he might break into Susan's house. However, for Hensley, he felt like one of these three men is the killer. He's about to get his answer. But as he read through each of these reports, he went from exhilaration to confusion, and finally just total disbelief, because none of these prints that he'd submitted matched the ones from Susan's tub. Hensley wanted so badly to solve this case, to give Susan's father Joe, his friend, some closure. But now, he felt like he was totally out of ideas. Susan's case ultimately went completely cold. Sergeant Hensley retired, and 19 years passed by. And then one day, in early 2006, Lieutenant Don Miller of the Stephenville Police Department took a box labeled Susan Woods down from a shelf in evidence storage, carried it back to his office, sat down at his desk, and began to look through its contents. Miller had recently been tasked with reviewing the department's unsolved cases, including Susan's. He read all of Sergeant Hensley's notes, he studied the crime scene photos, and he reviewed all the witness statements. None of it looked very promising. In fact, it looked like all the suspects had basically been ruled out. But then he saw those palm prints that had been lifted from Susan's bathtub, which had never been matched to anyone, and he had an idea. Back in 1987, there had been no centralized database of fingerprints. This meant that unless you had a specific suspect to compare an unknown prints against, the unknown print was effectively useless. And that's really what had happened in Susan's case. None of the suspects had matched this unknown print, so the case was put on a shelf. But in 2006, the FBI now had a national database of all the fingerprints of everybody in America who had ever been arrested and fingerprinted. And this meant that if Susan's killer had ever been arrested for any crime anywhere, their fingerprints would likely be in that database. Now, Lieutenant Miller did not have the budget or the time for a full-blown reinvestigation here, but he certainly had the time and money to just submit those prints into this FBI database to just see if there was a hit. So he submitted them and then put her case file back in storage. And sure enough, a few days later, Miller was at his desk when his phone rang, and it was the FBI, and they told him they had found a match. But when the FBI agent told Miller the name of the person whose prints these matched, it meant nothing to Miller. He didn't think he'd actually even heard the name before, and the person had been arrested for robbery in Nevada, not Texas. Miller thanked the agent, and he quickly began digging through this person's history, and he also went and got the Susan Woods case file. And slowly but surely, it all began to come together. And as Miller read through in her file all the names of the people that Susan spent her time with, he noticed something. And finally, it all just clicked. Lieutenant Miller had found the killer. Based on evidence collected at the crime scene and the killer's written confession, the following is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Susan Woods on the evening of Sunday, July 26, 1987. Stephenville's Main Street was busy as the killer drove through town in their brown pickup, sipping a mixture of soda, vodka, and cough syrup. They stared out their window at all the happy people in the restaurants and the storefronts, and as they stared at these people, a darkness stirred inside the killer. This darkness had been there for years, telling the killer they were no good and they would never be close to anyone. Alcohol was the only thing that seemed to make this darkness go away. so the killer stayed half drunk most of the time. But sometimes even the alcohol wasn't enough. A few years back, when the TV news had been running non-stop with talk about devil worshipping, the killer had been sort of inspired, and they thought they might try that. And so they had lit a bunch of candles and set them around their room in the shape of a pentagram, and then the killer stripped off their clothes, they stretched out on the floor, and they offered up their soul to the devil in exchange for freedom from this darkness. But unfortunately, the darkness remained. And so now, the killer, feeling very riled up, took another drink and thought of Susan and the way she'd smiled at them the last time they had seen each other. The killer had not had the courage to make a move back then, but now, with this buzz that they had from their drink, they really couldn't see a good reason not to make a pass at Susan. So they turned off the main road and they drove the short distance to Susan's house. In a matter of minutes, the killer was at her door, knocking. Susan opened the door and surprise flashed across her face, but then it softened into a smile and she told them to come on in. Susan told them to get comfortable, and as they sat down on the couch, she went to the kitchen to get the killer a Coke and some snacks. Then she brought them back and she sat down on the couch next to the killer to talk and catch up. And that was when the killer made their move. They leaned in to kiss her. But Susan immediately pulled back, suddenly angry. The killer grabbed her, and Susan slapped them across the face. And right then, the killer exploded. It would take almost 20 years, but that single action of the killer placing their hands on the bathtub did eventually give Lieutenant Miller the killer's identity. He was the younger cousin of Susan's best friend, Cindy Hallmark, and he was one of the members of that roundtable group who supported Susan through her divorce. He had also been at Susan's funeral and helped her friends through the aftermath of her death. The killer's name was Scott Hatley, and just a week before he killed her, he had been hanging out with the members of the round table, and Susan was there. And Susan, who was this, very shy, gentle person, had sort of opened up around this group. She was feeling happier and happier, largely because this group of friends, including Scott, had been so supportive. She really felt like she belonged here and was safe here. And during that meeting amongst the members of the round table, just sort of inexplicably, Susan had looked over at Scott and simply smiled at him. And for that reason pretty much alone, Scott, a week later, had shown up on her doorstep and murdered her. By the time Lieutenant Miller put all of this together, Hatley was 41 years old and was still a free man. And so on June 7, 2006, Miller had him arrested and charged him with Susan's murder. He would ultimately take a plea deal and was sentenced to 30 years in prison, but would only serve 11 years before he was released for good behavior. However, 3 years after Hatley got out of prison, he was found dead inside of his RV from cancer complications. And among his things, investigators would find this handwritten diary where he confessed to Susan's murder. The pages were also filled with references to Satan and demons, and Hatley specifically wrote that some kind of outside presence had been responsible for pushing him to ultimately assault and kill Susan. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. So click here and give them a watch. All right, until next time, see ya.
Every year, hundreds of people go missing under baffling conditions in the woods of North America. I'm talking about people who are right in front of someone and then in an instant, they're just gone. Or in other cases, they disappear and then are found again, but they're located in places that are impossible to get to. One former police detective named David Paulides has investigated thousands of these strange disappearances, and he documents what he finds in his incredible book series called Missing 411. Today, we're going to look at 3 Missing 411 cases that even amongst strange disappearances, these rank as particularly bizarre. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right channel because that's all we do, and we upload 3, 4, even 5 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, please gift the like button a free stay at a Motel 6, but call ahead of time to ensure the staff does not leave the light on for them. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our and it's home to one of the oldest foot races in America called the Mount Marathon Race. Now, this race is not actually a marathon because a marathon by definition is 26.2 miles long. The Mount Marathon Race is actually only 3 miles long, but it's considered one of the most challenging short races in the world because it's basically 1.5 miles straight up a mountain and then 1.5 miles straight back down again. Despite its grueling nature, there had never been a fatality or a disappearance during the running of this race. But that changed in 2012. 66-year-old Alaskan resident Paul LeMaitre was a career counselor on a military base in Anchorage. His job was to help outgoing military members adjust to civilian life, and his primary responsibility was helping them with their resume. Outside of work, Paul liked to keep himself in top physical shape, and one of his favorite activities was going for runs. And so in 2012, he finally committed to running the Mount Marathon Race, something he had wanted to do for some time, but he kept putting it off. In the months leading up to the race, Paul trained hard to make sure he was ready. He wasn't trying to win the race or really even be competitive. He just wanted to finish the race in a respectable time. So at 3 p.m. on July 4th, 2012, Paul found himself at the start of the Mount Marathon Race, and his family was on the sidewalk cheering him on. The race director fired the starting gun, and Paul, along with 500 other racers, took off. For reference, a man of Paul's age and physical fitness level should be able to complete this race in about 2 hours or less. But at 5 p.m., when virtually all the other runners had finished the race and Paul was nowhere to be found, his family members were concerned, but they knew he wasn't trying to win the race. They knew he was probably going to be on the slower end, but they were now starting to pay attention and were anxious for him to show up. 45 minutes later, a race timing crew up at the top of the mountain at the turnaround point began breaking down their setup. About 15 minutes later, when they were done, they started walking down the mountain right as Paul showed up at the top. And they said to him, "You are the last racer on this course. Do you still want to continue?" And he said, "Yes, I definitely still want to continue." And so the timing crew said, "That's fine. Just take your time, be careful, and we'll see you at the bottom." And so the timing crew, they take off right in front of Paul, going straight down this well-marked course, and they would turn around and see Paul standing there, catching his breath, getting ready to make his own descent. And so the timing crew, who was moving much faster than Paul, very quickly got out of sight of him. And so before long, they were at the bottom, they turned around, and there's no sign of Paul. So they went and found Paul's family and said, "Hey, we just spoke to him. He seems totally fine, but just so you know, if you don't see him in 90 minutes, I would contact the race officials and let them know, because he should be down by then." And so Paul's family sat at the bottom of this race looking up, expecting to see him any moment, but 90 minutes came and went and he never showed up. They wound up waiting another 30 minutes just in case, but again, he didn't show up, and so they informed race officials. The race officials immediately contacted the Alaskan State Troopers, and a search was launched for him because now fog's rolling in, this is a dangerous course, and it's starting to get pretty late. All night, hundreds of expert Alaskan searchers combed this mountain, both on the course, outside the course. They even went on the backside of Mount Marathon, where it would have been extremely difficult for Paul to have gotten there. He would have had to climb up and over the mountain, which is just extremely unlikely, but they figured we can't leave any stone unturned. And so all night they're looking, they got dogs out, and there's no sign of him. The next morning, when the fog cleared up, they brought in helicopters with thermal cameras, and they continued to search the mountain. But after 4 more days, they never found Paul or any of his belongings, and so they called off the search. It was like Paul had just vanished. Now, it's easy to jump to the conclusion that Paul must have just gotten disoriented and lost the course track, and then maybe he fell, or he was attacked by an animal like a bear, because this is Alaska. But there's a couple problems with that. The first one is the course itself is extremely well marked. This race is one of the oldest in America. They've been doing this for over 100 years, and they've never had a missing person or a fatality. So they know how to keep people safely inside of the course bounds. The other issue is the timing crew saw Paul at the top, at the turnaround, and he was physically okay. He was talking to them, he was not distressed, and he would have very clearly seen where to go next, because he would have seen the timing crew leaving ahead of him, going down the trail that he would have to follow. Clearly, something unusual happened to Paul either at the summit after the timing crew left or on the way down, because rational explanations cannot account for how Paul could vanish so completely in such a controlled environment with so many expert searchers looking for him. But to this day, no one has ever found Paul or even the slightest trace that he was ever on that mountain. In late August of 2004, Kevin Bardsley and his 12-year-old son Garrett went on a father-son Boy Scout camping trip in the Uinta Mountains in northern Utah. Their campsite was situated next to Lake Quiberon inside of the Wasatch National Forest. The lake was actually pretty remote and difficult to access because it was almost completely surrounded by huge mountains. The only side you could get to the lake on was its western side, but the western trail leading to it was very cumbersome because you had to bypass 7 different lakes. And so by the time Kevin, Garrett, and the rest of the Boy Scouts and their fathers were at the lake, they were at least an hour's hike away from the nearest civilization. Early in the morning on August 20th, Kevin and Garrett woke up, they hopped out of their tents. None of the other campers had woken up yet, and so they decided they would head down to the lake to get some early fishing in. And so they got their gear and they began walking down the very well-defined 150-meter long trail down to the lake. As they get there, the sun's coming up over the mountains and they're really excited about their day of fishing. And so as Kevin is preparing a fishing rod for Garrett, Garrett was jumping around on different stones that were poking out of the water. And at some point he tripped and he fell into the water, soaking his shoes and his pants. And so he hopped out of the water and he's kind of laughing at himself, and he told his dad that he didn't care, he'd fish with wet feet and wet pants and he would change them later. And so Kevin laughed and handed his son his fishing rod, and then the two of them began to fish. After a while, when they hadn't caught anything, Garrett said to his dad that, you know what, Dad, this is actually pretty uncomfortable, I'm gonna go change my pants and my socks. And so Kevin said, no problem, I'll be here with our gear, I'll see you when you get back. And so Garrett stands up and he starts walking back up the well-defined 150-meter trail back up towards the campsite, and Kevin actually turned around and watched his son disappear into the trees, but he heard the sound of other campers at the campsite and so knew his son wouldn't be alone. For the next couple of minutes, Kevin kept fishing, but periodically would look over his shoulder expecting to see Garrett come out of the woods again, but he didn't. And after about 20 minutes, Kevin was a little bit concerned, so he picked up his fishing gear and began walking back up the trail towards the camp. When he got there, he saw other Boy Scouts and their fathers just getting up and having a bite to eat, and he's scanning around the campsite and he doesn't see Garrett, and so he goes over to Garrett's tent and he opens it up and Garrett's not in there, and there's no sign that he's removed any of his wet clothing in there. And so Kevin turns around and he asks one of the fathers, hey, have you seen Garrett? He was supposed to be up here a minute ago. And the father said, no, I haven't seen him. And so Kevin's starting to panic and he yells out to the group, hey, has anyone seen my son? Do you guys know where Garrett went? He was supposed to be up here. And no one knew where he was. They said, no, we haven't seen him. And so horrified, Kevin drops all of his gear and starts running back towards the lake, screaming for his son. And the other campers instinctively know what's going on, and so they chase after him, yelling for Garrett. Almost immediately, the sheriff's department was notified, and they launched this huge search that included the FBI. And so hundreds of people have descended into the area around the lake, and they're looking for Garrett. They can't find him, but later that afternoon, searchers were about a half mile away from where Garrett was last seen, and they found a single Nike sock that appeared to have been removed from a wet foot wedged into one of the boulders in this huge boulder field. Garrett's mother would confirm that was Garrett's sock, and so the search effort was shifted to this big boulder field, and for days they looked all over the place for him, but there was no sign of Garrett anywhere, and so eventually the search was terminated. The authorities determined this was an accident, that Garrett's father and the other campers had nothing to do with Garrett's disappearance. What their theory was is Garrett must have gotten lost on the walk back to the camp and then ultimately died of exposure. But the idea that a boy of Garrett's age would get lost along a well-defined 150-meter long trail that he was familiar with, that he had been on that day, that seems a little far-fetched. Also, as Garrett was walking down that trail, he would have heard the sounds of the other campers in the campsite. So that would have helped him figure out exactly where he needed to go. He's on a well-marked trail, he's walking towards the sound of the voices. But he never made it to the campsite because no one at the camp saw him, and there was no sign that he had put his wet clothes in his tent. So something happened to Garrett almost immediately when he left his father that caused him to wind up a half mile away in a boulder field with one sock missing. It screams abduction case. But remember, this campsite was over an hour's hike away from the nearest civilization, and they know this group of Boy Scouts and their fathers were the only ones in the area that day. It is possible that an animal could have taken Garrett, like a mountain lion, but there would have been signs of a struggle, and they didn't find any on the trail or anywhere nearby, and you would figure if he was getting dragged off by a big predator, he would have yelled out for help, but he didn't. He just left his dad, it was total silence, and then he vanished. And all we have is his one sock. In 1950, when Rosemary was 21 years old, she married the love of her life, Charles Bud Kunst, and they moved into a house together in San Anselmo, California. Together, they had 6 children and 11 grandchildren. They were known as a very active couple, that when they were not with their family and their grandkids, they were out on a hiking trail somewhere enjoying the outdoors. In 1998, Rosemary's life was derailed when she and her husband were in a horrific car accident. When she came to in the hospital, she was very badly injured, and she was told that her husband of nearly 50 years had not survived. Rosemary was devastated. She was lost without Bud. But for the next several months, she poured her energy into her rehab, which took up a lot of her time, and it kept her mind off of this terrible loss. But when she got back to strength and returned home, a wave of grief washed over her, and she began to desperately miss Bud. In 2000, when Rose turned 70, she heard about a backpacking trip that was being led by a group called the Earth Circle Organization, and it sounded like the perfect way for Rose to attempt to reconnect with her late husband. The group was led by an elder and chief of the Carrick tribe. His name was Charlie Red Hawk Tom, and every year he would bring this group out to Spirit Lake, which is inside of a wilderness area near Mount Shasta in California, and there they would go to the altar that Red Hawk had built right on the edge of this lake, and they would perform spirit dances and attempt to communicate with their dead loved ones. Rose wasn't going into this thinking she was literally going to be speaking to Bud. She wanted to just find a way to connect with him spiritually, so she was very excited about this trip. The lake itself sits at the base of a heavily forested bowl with high steep walls all around it. In fact, some people say it reminds them of being inside of a mini volcano. And because of those high steep walls, there's actually only one way in or out to the lake, and that's on the north side. The only other semi-feasible way to get in or out of the lake would be on the south side, where a river flows down into the lake. And where that river flows, the embankment is less steep, although it's still a 70-degree angle and would require climbing gear, and the terrain would be completely slick from the water running over it. So you could do it, but realistically, nobody does that. So on August 17th, Rosemary, along with Red Hawk's 12-year-old son, a cook, and 11 other people, set out for Spirit Lake. After a rigorous 12-mile horseback ride, they finally arrived at Spirit Lake, and they established their camp right on the trail that leads in and out. That night, all the participants had dinner together, and then they made their way over to the altar right next to the lake where Red Hawk was, and he performed a spirit dance, and then afterwards, as a group, they attempted to call out to their dead loved ones. The following morning at 9 a.m., once everyone was up, Red Hawk informed the group that they were going to take a day trip to another lake, and they'd be back that evening. Rose told Red Hawk that she'd actually prefer to just stay at their campsite and enjoy the beauty of the lake, and Red Hawk told her that was just fine. So Red Hawk and the main group left, leaving behind Rosemary, as well as Red Hawk's 12-year-old son named Chalet, and the cook. A little while later, at 1 p.m., Rose decided she wanted to take a little hike around the side of the lake, and so she asked Chalet if he wanted to join her. He said, "Thank you for the offer, but I'm going to stay here with the cook." And so Rosemary said, "That's totally fine. I don't mind going by myself." And so she asked the cook for some food. He handed her a bag lunch. She took it, said thank you, and then set off by herself heading south. 4 hours later, at 5 p.m., when Red Hawk and the rest of the group got back to the camp, Chalet and the cook informed him that Rosemary had not come back yet. A group was immediately sent out to look for her, but there was no sign of her. And so Red Hawk turned to his son and to the cook and said, "Explain to me again what happened." And they said she was totally normal. She just wanted to go for a hike, and she took some food, and we watched her disappear into the trees. They also told Red Hawk that they had been sitting in the trail that leads in and out of the lake the entire time Rosemary was gone, and they never saw her. So she didn't leave the lake. She's somewhere out there. Confused and very concerned, Red Hawk had one of the other participants leave the lake and go contact authorities, and within 24 hours, there were 50 searchers combing the lake for Rosemary. The head of the search and rescue team was a guy named Grizz Adams, who had led many other search and rescue efforts. After studying the area and talking to Chalet and the cook and the others who were there, he just could not understand how a 70-year-old woman had managed to vanish so quickly and completely, because there's no way she climbed out the south exit because she didn't have climbing gear, and physically she probably wasn't capable of that even with the right gear, and she didn't leave through the north exit, the main trail, because Chalet and the cook were there the entire time and they never saw her. So where was she? As the search continued to find nothing, Grizz called in more searchers on horseback, helicopters, and dog teams. But the dog teams immediately proved to be useless because they were unable to pick up her scent, despite the fact they knew exactly where she started and where she was going. Grizz said that was highly unusual. For the next several days, searchers looked in and around the lake and up onto the mountainsides, and all they could ever find was a small tuft of Rosemary's hair about a half-mile away from where she was last seen. But this hair did not help investigators come up with a theory as to what happened. Ultimately, after almost a week of searching and not finding their mother, Rosemary's children elected to terminate the search. Grizz Adams, the head of the search effort, said the only time he's ever seen something like this is when someone was trying to disappear. They were trying to end their life. But Rosemary, before she went on this hike, she asked Chalet to come with her. She wanted company. That's not indicative of someone that's trying to hurt themselves. But regardless of the reason, to this day, Rosemary has never been found. So that's going to do it, guys. If you found the secret in today's episode, let us know in the comments what it is and where you found it. So give us the timestamp. And if you're the first to do that, we'll pin you at the top of the comments section. If you enjoyed today's video and you haven't done this already, please gift the like button a free stay at a Motel 6, but ensure you call ahead of time and tell the staff not to leave the light on. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly 3, 4, even 5 video uploads. If you want to get in touch with me, you can direct message me on Instagram or on Twitter. My username for both platforms is the same. It's JohnBallen416. I also have a ton of content over on TikTok where my username is MrBallen. I also have a second YouTube channel called MrBallen Shorts where I post short videos. If you have a story suggestion, please submit it to our subreddit just called MrBallen. It's linked in the description below. So whether I see you on Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, Reddit, YouTube, or some combination, just know that I really appreciate your support, and until next time, that's going to do it. See ya. The scary part about today's story is it could happen to anyone. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload 3 or 4 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, please gift the like button one of those magic 8 balls that tells the future, but change all of the potential responses to reply hazy, try again. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any A 30-year-old man named Alex was at home in San Diego watching TV in bed. At some point, he noticed there was a slight pain in his left Achilles tendon. A tendon is the fibrous connective tissue that connects muscle to bone, and the Achilles tendon is the biggest tendon in your whole body, and it's the one you can feel on the back of your ankle. It connects your calf muscle to your heel. Alex had never had tendon pain before, and so he assumed it must just be tightness from the long walk he had taken that night around his neighborhood. And so after massaging it for a little while, eventually he kind of forgot about it and just kept watching TV until he fell asleep for the night. The next morning when Alex woke up, he immediately recognized that the pain in his left Achilles tendon was 10 times worse. It was blindingly painful, and then his right Achilles tendon was also now starting to hurt. And so he reflexively reached under the covers and tried to massage his sore tendons, but as soon as he touched the backs of his legs, he felt shooting pain in that area, and so he couldn't touch them anymore. And so instead, he swung his legs off the bed and he sat up on the edge of his bed. And then he slowly rocked forward until he transferred his weight onto his feet and tried to stand up. And as soon as he did, he fell to the ground because of the blinding pain in his tendons. And so he manages to pull himself back up using the bed. And then he hobbles his way out of his bedroom over to the top of the stairs. And then he grabs the railing and he carefully makes his way down the stairs. And as he's walking, it feels like the tendons are so tight, they're going to snap like a rubber band. And so he gets to the bottom of the stairs and he walks his way around into the kitchen, where he sits down and he kind of evaluates what's going on, and he thinks to himself, man, I must be developing a wicked case of tendinitis. Tendinitis is inflammation or irritation of the tendon. And so Alex grabbed his laptop, which was right in front of him. He opened it up and he began looking for ways to alleviate pain from tendinitis. And so after looking in a couple medical forums, he got up and hobbled his way over to the bathroom. He opened up the medicine cabinet and he grabbed the Icy Hot, which is a topical pain reliever, and then he hobbled his way into the first floor living living room where he laid down on the couch, and then he applied a healthy amount of icy hot on the backs of both of his legs right over his tendons, and then he propped his legs up on 2 pillows. And so he laid there and he's thinking, okay, so it's the weekend, I have today off, I'll just lay here until the pain subsides. But by that evening, the pain had not subsided, it had gotten progressively worse. And so Alex picked up the phone and he called a podiatrist, which is a doctor who specializes in feet and the lower half of your leg, and he made an appointment for the following morning to have a look at his Achilles tendons. And so after he hung up, Alex thought to himself, the best thing I can do is probably just go to bed. I'm bound to feel better in the morning. And so Alex hobbles his way back up the stairs, holding onto the railing, and he goes into his bathroom to wash his face. He reaches for the towel, and he notices his thumb is suddenly locked up, and he can't move his thumb. And then his other thumb, too, locks up, and he's looking at them, and he can't get them to move. And so with his other fingers, he tries to move that thumb and bend that thumb, but he can't do it. The tendon in both of his thumbs had suddenly become unbelievably tight to the point where he couldn't move his thumbs anymore. Up until this point, Alex had convinced himself that whatever was happening with his Achilles tendons was probably minor, that with or without medical intervention, it was bound to just get better. But now he wasn't so sure, because the thumb situation, that really scared him. He had never experienced anything like that, and he couldn't help but think that whatever was happening in his thumbs was probably what was happening in his Achilles, making this a much more complex problem. So Alex forgets about washing his face or even going to bed, and instead leaves the bathroom and grabs the railing and hobbles back downstairs. He makes his way into the kitchen with the stiff thumbs, and he sits down at the table, he opens up his laptop, and he begins looking for any information about what is happening to him. A few minutes into his search, he was about to type something into Google when all of a sudden he felt the rest of his fingers start to lock up. The tendons in his fingers were tightening up, just like his thumbs and just like his Achilles tendons. And so now Alex is going into crisis mode. He doesn't know what's happening to him. He has no idea what to do, but he manages to calm himself down, and he told himself, Alex, tomorrow you got a doctor's appointment. They'll know what's wrong with you. They will fix this. Everything's going to be just fine. And so despite his overwhelming urge to panic, he closes his laptop and he hobbles his way over to the stairs. He climbs up to the second floor and he goes directly into his bedroom, crawls in bed, and he goes to sleep. The next morning when he woke up, the tightness and pain in his Achilles tendons and in his hands had not gotten any worse. And that kind of comforted Alex. He's thinking, okay, we're past the worst of this. I just need to figure out what this is and then fix it. And so he crawled out of bed, he hobbled his way over to the stairs, he went down, he grabbed a quick bite to eat, and then he went outside to his car to head out to his doctor's appointment. When he got to his car, he reached for the door handle, and when he pulled on it, he felt an unbelievable surge of pain in the hand that was on the car. And when he looked down, all of the joints in that hand that had been pulling on the car, they had all separated. Like the connective tissue that kept his finger whole was no longer strong enough. So Alex screamed and he retracted his hand in horror, and when he looked at it, the joints had gone back to normal, but the pain in this hand persisted. And so on adrenaline alone, Alex managed to use his other hand and got the car door open. He went inside, and then he could barely grip the steering wheel because one hand is now wrecked and his other hand is not much better, but he managed to speed to the doctor's office. And then when he got inside, he could barely fill out the paperwork because one hand was wrecked and the other wasn't much better, so he couldn't grip the pen. But after he gave them his paperwork, the doctor finally came out and they brought him back to an exam room, and that's when Alex explained that originally it was just his Achilles tendons. That's why he had called for this appointment. But after making that appointment, not only had the pain in his Achilles gotten much, much worse, but there was also now pain and tightness in his hands, including one hand that had just fallen apart when he tried to open a door. Alex told the doctor that he had never experienced anything even remotely resembling this in his entire life. He led a very healthy lifestyle and really had no idea what could be causing this. Although he did say 10 days prior, he had finished a round of antibiotics. The drug was called Cipro, but previously he had used this drug with no issues. But as a precaution, he told the doctor because he knew one of the side effects of this drug was tendon problems. And so as a precaution, Alex had actually brought the paperwork for that drug, Cipro, and he gave it to the doctor. And so the doctor, after hearing the story, he reads through the fact sheet of this drug and he tells Alex that he doesn't think it's a side effect of the drug. He thinks Alex is showing all the signs of having an autoimmune disease, like lupus or multiple sclerosis, and that he needs to go to a rheumatologist and get tested for that. And so Alex is horrified by this. He can't believe that only a couple of days ago, he was totally normal, and now it felt like his whole life was falling apart. And so he left that appointment, he went out to his car, and he called a rheumatologist, and he set up an appointment for a couple of days later to get tested, and then he went home. And over the next couple of days, as he waited for that next appointment, his condition only got worse. Every muscle, joint, and connective tissue in his body was either extremely tight or hurt or both. By the time he made it to the rheumatologist's office, he could barely move on his own. After the doctor had run several tests on Alex, Alex began mentally preparing himself to be told that he had an autoimmune disease. He believed at this point that that was the most logical explanation for what was happening to him. But when the test results came back in, to Alex's shock, he was negative across the board. He did not have an autoimmune disease. And so Alex hobbled out of the office, he got out to his car, he sat down, and he was in pain and at a loss. He had no idea what was happening to his body, and it seemed like none of the experts knew either. And so when Alex got back to his house, he made his way into the kitchen and he sat down to do some more research, but he felt like he was at a loss there too. He didn't even know what to research. He had searched for every possible combination of pain, tightness in your Achilles, pain, tightness in your hands and your fingers, and nothing was lining up with his experience. And so he thought to himself, even though that podiatrist ruled out the antibiotic he had taken a cycle of before he started feeling the way he was feeling, even though he ruled that out, I might as well do some more research on it because it's the one thing I can point to that was newly introduced to my life before I had all these things happen to me. And so he opened up his laptop and he typed in Cipro side effects. And what he discovered horrified him. Cipro is part of a class of antibiotics called fluoroquinolones, and while it is a very effective antibiotic, it comes with extremely severe side effects. And enough people who have taken a fluoroquinolone have suffered from these side effects that there's actually a term given to them. They are said to have been floxed. And as Alex discovered in his research, there are many online communities for these floxed individuals, many of which used to be healthy and fit, but after taking these drugs, they became bedridden or had to transition to a wheelchair. This is due to one of the nastiest side effects of this class of drug: ruptured tendons. As a reminder, a tendon connects muscle to bone. And so if you were to say a tendon has ruptured, what you're actually saying is the muscle has torn off of the bone. And apparently, this is unbelievably painful and almost always requires surgery to fix. And in many of these floxing cases, the fluoroquinolone drugs cause these people's tendons to start dramatically tightening until they just start rupturing. And there's nothing they can do to stop it unless they stop moving, hence becoming bedridden and transitioning to wheelchairs. When Alex read all these horrible testimonials of people who had been floxed, he realized their experience mimicked his own. He was floxed. But once he knew what he was up against, he began looking for a timeline. How long would he have these symptoms for? And what he saw was most people experience these awful symptoms for about 3 months and then they fade away. So for 3 months, Alex suffered, but he stayed positive. He was certain he was going to get better. But 3 months came and went, and he didn't get better. In fact, he got worse. All of his tendons continued to tighten, and some of them ruptured, and he had to quit his job and had to move in with his parents. But he stayed positive. He went back online, and he began reading about more severe floxing cases, and he saw those people typically saw a big turnaround at the 3-year mark. And while that was overwhelming and awful and disheartening, he at least had something to look at as the light at the end of the tunnel. And so for 3 more years, he waited and waited in pain. He eventually became completely bedridden and completely dependent on his parents. But then the 3-year mark came and went, and much like the 3-month mark, nothing got better, he just got worse. And that was when Alex realized he was in the range of people that suffered from their floxing permanently. In 2016, so 7 years after taking that fateful dose of Cipro, he wrote a blog post on his website updating the world about his condition. In it, he says he's only gotten worse and that his life effectively came to an end in 2009 when over a 6-day period he swallowed those 12 Cipro pills. And so now all he looks forward to is his death. So that's going to do it, guys. If you found the secret in today's video, let us know in the comments section what it is and where you found it. So give us the timestamp. And if you're the first to do that, we'll pin you at the top of the comments section. If you got something out of today's video and you haven't done this already, please gift the like button one of those magic 8 balls that tells the future, except replace all of the potential answers with reply hazy, try again. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly 3 or 4 video uploads. If you want to get in touch with me, you can direct message me on Instagram or on Twitter. My username for both platforms is the same. It's JohnBallen416. I also have a ton of content over on TikTok where my username is MrBallen. I also have a second YouTube channel called MrBallen Shorts where I post random short videos and lost episodes. If you have a story suggestion, please submit it to our subreddit just called MrBallen. It's linked in the description below. So whether I see you on Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, Reddit, YouTube, or some combination, just know that I really appreciate your support, and until next time, that's going to do it. See ya. Sometimes, everyday people are forced to make truly unthinkable decisions. Take, for example, somebody who goes to work like normal, and then a fire breaks out in their office, they can't get rescued, and suddenly this person is deciding whether they want to burn to death or jump out the window to their death. Now, when we hear about these totally tragic stories, we all wonder the same thing. What would we do in that situation? Well, I want you to keep that question in the back of your mind as you listen to today's story, because it's about these 2 people who find themselves in a totally hopeless situation. And so as it unfolds, Lance knew the 2 men who owned this red Mazda had taken out a one-night permit to be allowed to go into Rattlesnake Canyon, which is one of the most isolated parts of this national park. It's basically just a single long, scrubby little trail that's kind of all desert with high canyon walls on either side. In order to get access to Rattlesnake Canyon, people need to go to the visitor center and literally fill out paperwork so the park rangers know they're out there and can go out and check on them if they don't come back in time. And so the 2 men who owned the Mazda had done that. They had filled out all the paperwork, but now Lance was noticing they had not returned at the end of their permit. They had stayed out, presumably in Rattlesnake Canyon, for an additional 3 nights. Now, Lance was not concerned because people did do this. It was more like he was annoyed because now he would have to go out into Rattlesnake Canyon and find these 2 guys and figure out what was going on. So Lance and the park volunteer that he was with began walking on the trail in the direction of Rattlesnake Canyon. And after walking less than a mile on this trail, Lance and this volunteer looked up ahead, and just off the trail, there was a green and maroon tent that was pitched right out in the open. And so Lance immediately assumed that this had to be the 2 men who owned the red Mazda. And so very quickly, Lance's annoyance was replaced with relief, because it turned out it was really easy to find these 2 campers, and he'd be able to go figure out what was going on and either get them back to their car and get them to leave, or if they wanted to, they could, in theory, extend and stay longer with the right permitting. But when Lance and his partner walked down the trail and left the trail to go walk over to this tent, they started to notice there was something off about it. Right away, as they got closer and closer to this tent, they began to smell this horrible kind of chemical burning smell, and then also all over the ground were all these little bits of burned pieces of trash. And then finally, when Lance and his partner actually arrived right in front of the tent, and they were looking down at the closed flap, it was zipped shut, they saw clearly there was something moving around inside of the tent. But whoever or whatever it was wasn't making any noise. And so Lance and his partner, they kind of looked at each other, and they both at this point were pretty nervous. Their hearts are racing. They don't know what's going on here. And then Lance just kind of impulsively reached down, unzipped the tent, and lifted it open. And when he saw what was inside, he immediately was hit with this wave of fear and anxiety. 3 days earlier, on August 5th, 1999, a 26-year-old man named David Coughlin woke up in a sleeping bag inside of his green and maroon tent in Rattlesnake Canyon. And as soon as David sat up, he smiled because he could hear right outside of his tent the sound of his best friend, Raffi Kodakian, making breakfast and gathering up supplies for that morning's hike. Dave and Raffi were on what they called a trip of a lifetime. 6 days earlier, they had left their hometown of Boston, Massachusetts, and traveled more than 2,000 miles west, sleeping at campsites and cheap motels along the way. Their final destination was a university in Santa Barbara, California, where Dave was going to be getting his master's in environmental engineering, but they were going to basically turn the journey out to California into a big vacation. And Carlsbad Caverns National Park was easily both of the men's favorite spots so far, because unlike the other campgrounds they had stayed at so far, which were kind of cheap and small, Carlsbad Caverns was huge. It was 47,000 acres of just wild desert. And so for Dave and Raffi, whose normal everyday lives were kind of safe and boring, doing desk jobs and the like, this felt sort of thrilling, like they were cowboys exploring the Wild West. As Dave sat inside of his tent, listening to Raffi make breakfast and get ready, Dave noticed he was already sweating, despite it being pretty early in the morning. It was just already so hot outside. And so Dave grabbed his water and took a sip, and as he did, he thought about that park ranger who had helped them fill out their paperwork to be allowed to come out into Rattlesnake Canyon, who had made a really big deal about ensuring that Dave and Raffi each have at least 1 gallon of water per person per day that they were going to be out here because of the heat. But after they had left the park ranger, Raffi, who had way more experience camping than Dave did, explained to Dave that that was totally overkill and they didn't need that much water. So instead of bringing 2 huge gallons of water for the single night they planned to be out in Rattlesnake Canyon, Raffi had brought along for both of them just 3 16-ounce bottles of water. For reference, that's approximately 6 times less than what the park ranger had suggested. The men had already used one of those 16-ounce bottles of water to boil hot dogs the night before for their dinner, and now the bottle that Dave was drinking from was already half empty, and so he was pretty much down to the last of his water. But Dave wasn't really worried about his water because he and Raffi were going to be hiking out of Rattlesnake Canyon that day and heading back to their car and continuing their journey out to California, and they knew they had set up their tent very close to the parking lot, and so it was a short hike, they're back in their car, and then they're good. And so Dave capped his water, he got out of his sleeping bag, he left the tent, and he joined Raffi in prepping their supplies to get ready for their hike out. And by 8:30 a.m., their entire site was packed up, and the 2 men were on their way heading back. The 2 men walked at a leisurely pace in the direction towards their vehicle for about an hour, and as they walked, they did see signs that they were on the right trail. There were these stacks of white rocks that marked the trail. But after walking this full hour, they knew they probably should have been at the parking lot, but they didn't see it yet. However, the 2 men were not worried yet because remember, they know they're close, and so they're thinking, okay, maybe a couple more minutes and we'll see the parking lot. And so they stopped, they had some more water, and then they kept on walking. But after walking for another 2-3 hours, still in the direction that they believe was towards the parking lot, they did not see the parking lot. In fact, they didn't see anything that looked familiar, and there were no more stacks of white rocks to show they were even on a trail. They were totally lost. And so Dave and Raffi, who were doing their best not to panic, they both sat down, they pulled off their packs, and they pulled out their topographical map and began looking for some sign of where they were. But neither man could read the topographical map, and so all the swirls on the map showing every contour of every geographical feature, it just didn't make any sense to them, and so the map was of no use, and it was getting hotter and hotter by the minute. And so Dave and Raffi put the map away, feeling totally frustrated, and for a second they thought about getting up and just continuing to walk roughly in the direction they thought they should go. But as soon as they stood up, they both just felt so exhausted from walking and the heat, which was now, it's noon, so it's really burning down on them. And so the two men just walked over to the edge of a canyon wall where some shrubs were kind of hanging off the wall, providing a little bit of shade. And the two men just plunked down right underneath this shade, and they just sat there in silence. Both men knew they did not have the supplies to stay out in this canyon for much longer. They certainly didn't have enough water, which now really was starting to feel like a huge oversight. But luckily, as they're just sitting there, these huge storm clouds rolled in, and for a very short amount of time, there was this incredible downpour of rain. And so Dave and Raffi begin catching the raindrops in their mouths, and they begin drinking the water off of rocks and leaves. And I mean, it wasn't a lot, but it was enough to kind of boost their spirits. They got a little bit more hydration in, and they were kind of ready to deal with the problem they were facing. After the storm had gone, Dave and Raffi decided that their best move was just to continue walking and try to find this parking lot. But despite this motivation, Dave and Raffi would walk for hours and hours into the night. They would not find the parking lot, and so finally they realized they would have to stop and set up camp for another night. And so Dave and Raffi, who by now were really starting to feel scared, they found this washed out gully and they set up their green and maroon tent, but neither man could sleep. And so they just sat outside of their tent, telling each other that don't worry, the park rangers are bound to have noticed that we did not come back in time. We only had that 1-day permit. We've exceeded the limit. They're bound to come out here and find us. But in the back of both Dave and Raffi's mind, they weren't so sure that was definitely going to happen. They didn't really know how long it would take for park rangers to notice when people stayed too long. But as Dave and Raffi were speaking, they suddenly noticed far off in the distance something that looked like headlights, like on a car, and it was moving across the horizon. And both Dave and Raffi thought, wait a minute, that's got to be a road right there. All we have to do is go to that road and we're saved. We don't need the park rangers to come rescue us. And so suddenly Dave and Raffi were filled with hope, and they forgot about how thirsty and hungry they were. Then they just crawled into their beds and they fell asleep almost immediately, because all they wanted to do was get to the next morning where there'd be daylight so they could hike out and get to that road and get back home. Dave and Raffi woke up early the next morning, and they were very eager to get up and start making their way towards this road. But instead of packing up their campsite and bringing it with them, they decided instead to leave their campsite and leave behind a journal that had some information about who they were and what they were doing in case park rangers came looking for them. And so Dave pulled out a journal from his pack, and he drew a kind of crude map of where this campsite was and where they were going towards this road that appeared to be up on this ridge. And then also Dave included in this note, Dave and Raffi's names, their ages, where they lived, some contact info, and also the fact that they were completely out of food and water, and that if you find this journal, please follow up and make sure we're okay. And so after leaving behind this journal at the campsite, Dave and Raffi set off to go to this road. But after walking for hours and hours up a kind of gradual incline, they reached what appeared to be this kind of third ridge, where up and above the ridge was this road. But to get up onto this kind of wall right in front of them was really challenging. There was cactus everywhere, and the gullies that kind of led up to the top of this ridge were very slippery and almost vertical, so nearly impossible to climb. And so this was really a chore getting up there. And you got to remember that Dave and Raffi are already totally exhausted. They have no food, no water, and so this is miserable. But eventually Dave and Raffi were able to get up onto this ridge, and they looked out, and there was no road. There was nothing. It was just pure desert as far as they could see. And so they had no idea what those lights were that they saw. Clearly it was not headlights. I mean, for all they knew, it could have been a figment of their imagination. They're desperate to be saved, and so maybe it was possible that they imagined seeing this road. And so as the two men stared in stunned silence at nothingness in front of them, they noticed that a buzzard had actually begun flying in slow circles over their head, almost like it was just waiting for the two men to die so the buzzard could come down and eat them. Now, Dave was ready right then and there to head back to their campsite and just wait, but Raffi was insistent that they just keep on going, because you never know, maybe there is a road just a little bit farther along. But after walking for maybe a couple more hours, they did not see a road, and by this point both men were beyond exhausted, and so the two men did finally turn around and painstakingly walk their way all the way back to their campsite. And as they're walking, they're telling themselves, maybe we'll get there and park rangers will be waiting for us, a search party will be here. But when they got to their campsite, there was absolutely no sign that anybody had come to their campsite since they left. Their journal with their note and their crude map and all that was still just sitting right in the middle of their campsite, untouched. And it was at this point that Dave and Rafi's spirits were just totally broken. The next morning was Saturday, August 7th. So Dave and Rafi were now beginning their 4th day in the desert and their 3rd day without any water. Rafi had gotten really sick from drinking his own urine, and Dave had begun to experience all these horrible stomach cramps, very likely from eating unripe prickly pears. Also, Dave's legs were starting to seize up, which made it nearly impossible to walk. And so the two men knew they had no chance of hiking out of here to safety. They really just had to wait for their rescue to come. And so that day, Dave and Rafi attempted, with the little energy they had, to make a huge SOS symbol on the ground using rocks. But after putting the S down and the O down, they didn't have enough energy to collect more rocks to make the last S. And so they did not finish their SOS symbol. And then also Rafi at some point soaked his sleeping bag in fuel and lit it on fire to try to create a smoke signal that somebody might see. But the smoke didn't get high enough, and so it didn't work. And so all that really accomplished was it destroyed Rafi's sleeping bag and also created this terrible stench around their campsite of burning chemicals from having burned the polyester material that made up the sleeping bag. And so by that afternoon, when the sun was right over their head and beating down on them, Dave and Rafi just crawled inside of their tent and laid there in silence. And as they did, they noticed the stones underneath their tent felt kind of cool, and so they cut the bottom of the tent out and just laid directly on these loose rocks inside of their tent. By that evening, when still no rescuers had arrived, Dave and Rafi really began to realize that this could be the end. And so Dave, he grabbed that notebook where they had drawn that crude map of where the lights and the road had been, and he flipped the page, and then he wrote a note to his girlfriend, basically saying goodbye, because he knew he was probably going to die. And then Rafi, he took the journal, and he did something similar, but also included that, he would not allow the buzzards to get them, that they would at least ensure their bodies were intact for their families to find. And then after writing these notes and tucking the journal away, Dave and Rafi crawled out of the tent because by now it's dark out, the sun's not out, it's a little bit cooler outside. And the two men, they sat down and they began having a fairly matter-of-fact conversation about the situation they were in. Both men were very emotional. At one point, Dave began screaming and crying just out of despair. But at the end of this conversation, the two men made a decision, an unthinkable one, that really would only ever be made in a situation like this. And so after both men were on the same page, they crawled inside the tent and zipped it up. It was the next morning, August 8th, 1999, when that park ranger and his volunteer that was with him had walked along the trail towards Rattlesnake Canyon and discovered Dave and Rafi's ransacked campsite. And they had walked up and they had seen all the burned materials nearby, which was Rafi's sleeping bag and other bits of trash they had tried to burn. And then they had gone to the front of the tent, and Lance had opened it up, and when he looked inside, he saw Rafi, who was alive. He was laying on his side, and he was only wearing these filthy green shorts, and he just looked totally emaciated and terrible and haggard. I mean, the guy really looked like he was on death's door. And then Rafi, when he saw Lance looking in, he just said, "Please tell me you have some water." And Lance did have some water. He gave it to him. And then Lance, knowing that Rafi was with another person, Dave, he said, "Hey, where is the guy you were with?" And Rafi, as he's drinking the water, just kind of casually pointed out of the tent somewhere off behind where Lance and his partner was. And so Lance and his partner, they turned around and they didn't see anybody. They were just kind of looking off towards the canyon wall, and there was nothing there. And so Lance turned around again and he said, "Are you sure he's over there?" And Rafi, without any expression on his face, just continued to point and said, "Yes, he's right over there." And so Lance, he got up, he turned around, and he began walking towards this canyon wall. But before he got there, he nearly tripped over this arrangement of rocks on the ground. And when he looked down at them, he knew someone clearly had arranged these rocks in a particular way. And so, with a growing sense of dread, Lance reached down and he moved aside one of these rocks. And underneath it, he saw Dave's face. It would turn out, the night before, when Rafi and Dave had crawled outside of their tent and began having that very intense conversation, what they were talking about is, what do? We know we're going to die. No one's going to reach us before we die of starvation, or we die of dehydration, or maybe some animal is going to come attack us and kill us. Like, we don't have any hope. And so as they were sitting there, Dave actually pulled out his pocket knife and attempted to cut his wrists, but he couldn't cut deep enough to actually kill himself. And so Dave said to Raffi, "You're gonna have to kill me. And then after that, you're gonna have to kill yourself." And Raffi had agreed. And so Raffi and Dave, they went back inside their tent with no floor. It's just open rocks in the bottom. And Dave, he lied down on his back and he pulled his shirt up and he exposed his rib cage. And then Raffi pulled out his 4-inch pocket knife and he placed it right up against Dave's rib cage. And then with Dave basically egging him on to stab him, Raffi attempted to push the knife into his heart, but he couldn't break the skin. And so Dave, he's now screaming out in pain, but he's still urging Raffi to come on, just do it already. And finally, Raffi does manage to get the knife right through his ribs and into Dave's heart. Dave did not die right away, but Raffi covered his mouth and continued to push that knife in until he did die. And then once Dave was dead, Raffi used the little bit of energy he had to drag his body away from the tent, where he buried him under those rocks. And then Raffi, who now has no energy left, just crawled back to his tent and laid down on those loose rocks inside of his tent and waited to die. But just a few hours later, on the morning of August 8th, Lance the park ranger, along with his volunteer, had come down and discovered Raffi before he had died. Little did Dave and Raffi know, this campsite where they had been for the past few days was just a 15 or 20-minute walk from their car. 9 months later, on May 11th, 2000, Raffi pled guilty to murder and was sentenced to 16 years in prison. However, Raffi insisted throughout the trial that the reason he killed Dave was because Dave asked him to. It effectively was a mercy killing, and that Raffi intended afterwards to die himself. This was murder-suicide. And Dave's family believed Raffi, and so did another judge. And so ultimately, Raffi would only serve 16 months in prison before he would be released. So that's going to do it. If you got something out of today's episode and you want to hear more stories like this one, be sure to check out our podcast called the MrBallen Podcast, where we have literally hundreds more stories available right now. Again, the podcast is just called the MrBallen Podcast, and it's available exclusively on Amazon Music.